In September of 1995, I was working on the farm that my husband and I own. It is a full-scale farming operation with livestock that consists of beef, pigs, chickens for eggs, and it also has soybeans, corn, alfalfa hay, green beans, and peas in season. On September 13th, 1995, at approximately 6:30 a.m. while doing the morning chores, I went out to feed our chickens which were in the coops in the yard. There are two dogs who are generally with me when doing this chore, and they too were out there, wagging their tails as usual, indicating all is well. This particular day, though, there must have been something spooking them, because both dogs refused to come out of one coop where they always go into. I was wondering what would cause this to happen. They are well trained and not easily spooked. I decided that I would just go ahead and take care of the chickens myself. I never had a problem feeding them previous to this. So, I simply went back in the house for about 20 minutes. Came back out to feed them again. Since I needed more feed than before, I walked across the yard rather than driving my tractor to replenish their food supply. As I crossed over behind where the pigs were, something caught my attention, and as soon as it did, both dogs began barking like crazy, now that they too saw whatever it was. They were barking up behind the wooded hillside behind our barn. The barking was frantic, like, "Hey, come here. Hey, come look at this." I looked up the hillside and saw what I best can describe as a large upright canine with its back towards me. It was covered in pitch blackish fur, like coal. It had long hair hanging down its arms and side of its body. It did not touch the ground, though. Its ears were very pointed and cropped. They kind of moved like they were trying to pinpoint where my dogs were barking from, or get an idea of where I was too. Then this thing whirled around quickly, without turning its head, and offered me a full frontal view of itself before it took off running into the woods behind our house. And all I could think to say was, "Oh my gosh." This was not a bear or a wolf that I have ever seen before in my life. Now, about 4 weeks goes by, and my husband and I were walking in the same area where this creature had come down from the hillside right behind our house. There are no bears in southern Wisconsin, except for one that has been reported on occasion. But there are wolves and coyotes, so you would think it must have been one of them if anything at all. We were walking up to the top of the hill when something again caught my attention, and my husband's attention. He actually pointed out where he saw it go through some trees into an old strip mine. He said it reminded him of a black fox with very pointed ears, which is what I would have assumed too. But then, since both dogs reacted to it like they did, I had to rethink that decision and decided it must have been something else. It was at least 6 feet tall, with very long legs, very muscular. Again, it was no bear or deer. Its rear end was high up in the air when running, but the back leg on each side were bent forward more than on either a dog or coyote, which is what made its movement slightly different. Since this has happened, I've talked to several people who have said they have saw some kind of large black canine creature around that time too. Some even thought that it may be the same one. Now, about 3 years later, our next door neighbors came over to visit while we were doing some chores, telling us about their sightings too. They had just bought their place in 1994, the year before our encounter. They had just gotten done with their evening chores of feeding, etc., around 9 p.m. when they were out in their barnyard. They looked up into the sky overhead to see if there was any chance of rain, which there wasn't. Then, both of them saw what they thought at first was a large black dog running across the upper edge of their field, going down over the hillside nearby. The dogs had all come out of the house to greet them, so it must have been after 9:30. The next morning, my husband goes over there to talk to him about what he had saw, because I had told him to, and this is when we found out that they too had seen it. Their description was the same as mine, except they said it was bigger than their German Shepherd. The neighbor told me that he thought it might be what some people call a black panther, but he didn't say it exactly like that. That's just what I heard him say to my husband. My mother-in-law lived on the next farm over, and she had an encounter with this creature too. This was August of 1996. about 7:30 p.m. at night. She was outside, lambing in the barnyard. She used to raise sheep. She looked up into the sky as well above her house. She heard something large running overhead, like leaping, and saw 3 of these creatures running across the yard on the upper edge of her yard. All 3 of them, one behind the other. She said that they were 2 jet black in color, long tail, and their bellies almost dragging to the ground. They ran into an open strip mine on her neighbor's property. This had been closed for years. But she heard some coyotes yipping and yelping in there, as though they came back out again not too long after going in. Then, at about 8:45 p.m., as she was getting ready to go inside for the night, those same 3 creatures came back across her yard again, heading toward those same old mines, but instead went down into another part of a now owned property by the Amish man. He had bought it 2 months ago. It is partly open and used as pasture land now. My mother-in-law was going to go get her husband to come look at it with her, but then didn't think he would even believe her, so she just went in and got him out of bed instead. He said that when they came back up over the hill, there was a farmer who was driving along in his truck. When they crossed the road in front of him, he stopped when my mother-in-law and father-in-law flagged him down and told them what they saw. This man had lived in that town his whole life, hunted all through that same old strip mines since he was a kid. These creatures were not something new to him. When asked what they were and what they looked like, he described them as looking like Black Panthers too. Her husband made it sound like there were several of them, but I think that was just because he wasn't sure of what he saw. So that's 4 people who have seen this thing over the last 16 years. 3 within a month. Another neighbor, who lived a 3/4 mile away, told us his own nephew had seen it one night when riding home on his bike at dusk. He was coming down along an old road through an open strip mine when something big jumped up off the side and into the woods right in his path. The boy described it as being black, having a long stringy tail, and bigger than anything he'd ever seen before. This creature is fast, we know that now. It can jump very high too. It can climb. It will do whatever it can. I've seen what I believe to be its tracks in the snow, but unfortunately, I can't be too sure. The tracks were reminiscent of a very, very large canine print. While the other farmer who bought the other strip mine described seeing one run across his field late last summer, as described seeing it as it was going after his cattle. He lives at least 2 miles away from us. That's all I have for you right now. Hopefully this is enough for you to understand and believe that these things really do exist. July 4th, 2012, at 2 p.m. I saw the beast while out on a lunch break at work. I work for the U.S. Army. 2 nights ago, I just returned from Iraq and was getting ready to go see the Independence Day festivities in my local town. A lot of people gather around basins to watch fireworks and whatnot. The location is near a river basin, where it's very heavily wooded, having lots of vegetation and hills, and even some small caves here and there, hidden in some places, but overtaken by thick foliage and vegetation. There's also like a section that goes through this area that troops will use when training, but they never train on July 4th. They don't want to disturb civilians or anybody who decides to stay outdoors on such an occasion. It was now about 2 p.m. when I noticed this creature. It was very big, standing about 7 feet tall and had dark grayish hair covering its whole body. What was weird about it, though, is the way it looked, and that it walked on its 2 legs. But it also kind of looked canine and had a strange gait to its walk. I'm talking like half human, half canine here. Barely noticeable, though. You know what I mean? Also, something else strange about this creature is that at times, when it would figure someone out noticed it, rather than run away or make any attempt to hide itself, it would stand there staring right back at you with an angry look in its eyes like it wanted to attack you if it could. Whatever it could do. It acted like it couldn't get past whatever was between you and it, assuming it would be a fence or whatnot. At one point, it seemed as if it wanted to walk away from us all. So with a light jog kind of step, he or it sped off into the nearby vegetation, quickly dropping out of sight. I got a good look at it though. and what caught my eye the most was its eyes. They were a bright, striking yellow, almost like those things you see in old movies from back in the 60s that kids used to stare into. You know, those little kaleidoscope gizmos. They would turn them around until they saw something cool. Those kaleidoscope things always had a slight greenish glow to them, though rather than a brighter yellow distinct color. That brings me back to his eyes. They also had a greenish glow to them, but they were distinctly yellow. I think the only other times I've seen eyes like his was when I was doing research on vampires and lichens back in high school for a project of mine. I did it because it was around Halloween. This might sound weird or even unbelievable for you guys because it's kind of mind-boggling for me too. But what can I say? It happened. Back then, in 2008 though, something didn't feel right about the way his gaze pierced through me, as if he was daring me to come closer so he could break my neck, if not literally eat me alive. Like dark matter incarnate. That's how intense his gaze and mine felt. It was like staring into an abyss or some other dimension on a quantum level. I had to look away. Well, anyway, that's all for this story. All in all though, it was a very scary encounter, with something very strange, if you can't believe me. If not, it's up to you. I know what I saw, but then again, maybe I imagined the whole thing due to my PTSD from being in Iraq at the time. Either way, I'm still afraid of going out there, especially on July 4th. It's like it was a tempt of fate, purposely walking right into its territory, you know? You never know what could happen when meeting creatures like him on an open field where they have far more room to run around and get away from any barriers that people might put between them and their human prey. Polish police sergeant, identified as Sergeant Sławomir Rakowski, was walking his beat just outside of Warsaw when he heard a thumping noise and saw something moving towards him in the darkness. At first glance, it appeared to be a bear standing on its hind legs, coming at him with great speed. The canine-like creature ran very upright and on two legs instead of all fours, the way a normal wolf or canine would do. But this circular pattern is not completely new to us, so we will dismiss the idea that we are dealing only with an upright walking canine spotted thing here. More research is needed before we can make such sweeping claims without doubting ourselves later. The creature had a very large head, similar to that of a wolf. The head had bulging eyes on the other sides, a single flaring nostril in the center, and its body was covered with very short fur over most parts of it. Sergeant Rakowski got his weapon drawn after the thing looked directly at him and charged. However, it ran off when he pulled out his gun, but remained watching him from afar. He said he could see its eyes. The beast then disappeared into the woods before anything else had happened. Princeton Winton and his friend were coming down the mountain after a hike. They had not told anybody where they were going or when they would be back, and by roughly 2:30, it was getting dark. So we went looking for them. We hadn't found them at all in any of their usual haunts, and we were about to give up when we ran into three strangers sitting on a blanket beside one of the trails. They said that they had been stranded there due to their ship had crash-landed on top of Mount Shasta. All they had with them was some basic survival equipment. Now, I should say this. The fact that they claimed that they were crash-landed there, I mean, these were total hippies. I think they had taken a lot of acid and were pretty much just cracked out. Or as I like to say, fizzled out. They had their sleeping bags, cooking utensils, but nothing that looked like an actual spaceship, of course. They kept going on about feeling like they were half alien, half human. Again, guys, hippies. It didn't look anything like conventional spacecraft either, just something vaguely egg-shaped. Also, it didn't seem to be in any way like they really knew what they were talking about. But we did help them get down to lower elevations, and they offered us a ride, but we kindly declined. We could make it back if we hurried to Princeton and his friend, which we did eventually find. They told us that they were chased by a large bipedal canine, which we thought was very interesting, describing the events at hand. And once we heard his description of the creature, we knew that this was something else entirely. He claimed that he was chased by a large wolf that stood upright and drop down back on all fours once it got out of their territory. He claims that he came between this thing and a hunt, which is why it chased after him, although he kept asking me, what kind of wolf stands up on two legs like that? And why was it so large? I was driving home from work at about 11 p.m. I got up to about highway speed at Northeast 122nd Street in Portland, Oregon, when all the power went out in my car. The radio stopped working. The headlights turned off, leaving me with just city streetlights to see by, and only every other one was working. And then I saw it. Standing in the road, about 10 feet ahead of us, was what looked like a big wolf dog. It wasn't really furry, but looked more like the skin had been turned inside out. It was grotesque, and there were multiple people screaming. Its fur, its eyes, its tongue, even the pads of its feet were all black and exposed, and manged. It stood still as I approached it, and got closer, until it revealed all of its teeth. Every single one of them. It had an entire mouth full of needle-sharp black teeth. This all happened in an instant, and I swerved to avoid hitting it. Drove down a side street for fear of smashing into a tree or something if I tried going around it. As I made my turns, I kept checking my rearview mirror, thinking that surely the thing wouldn't just stand there and let me drive away from it. But as I turned onto 122nd from Sandy Boulevard, the thing was gone, completely vanished without a trace. I have no idea how to account for what I witnessed, but I was not the only one. Several other drivers saw it too. I'm surprised it has not been reported on. This was when I was 15. This was about 1:15 in the morning, in the middle of the forest. I was laying on my back, looking up and watching the sky. A friend and I were out camping together, watching meteor showers. This was a girl I liked a lot, so I tried and do the romantic stuff with her to try and get out of the friend zone, which never ended up working. Although the stars and the meteor shower which were amazing, if you've never seen one before. I awoke just as I saw what looked like a wolf or a big German shepherd dog on its hind legs running through a very thick patch of woods. It only happened for a second, but I distinctly remember the long muzzle and pointed ears. Now, I had a second encounter as well. This was more exciting. It was late at night, after a small barbecue or party at my uncle's farm. This was also miles north of Ann Arbor. I was coming out of the barn to get some more food when I heard some branches snapping. This was right in the tree line to my right. My first thought was either bear or maybe a deer, so I stayed still because it sounded large. I turned and saw the creature move, right around the base of a tree to my right, maybe 40 feet away if not closer. I decided it wasn't anything that I wanted to deal with. This thing had to have easily been 7 feet tall, moving on two legs up the hill towards me, in my direction. It looked very pale, but there were no other features that stood out, since it was getting dark. Once again, it saw me, began to approach me, and then turned around as other family were coming to the barn, like it wanted to try and stay concealed and hidden, and it disappeared quickly into the woods. It is now 4 days later, and I haven't heard anything else from anybody in my area regarding any strange things going on lately. But I'll try keeping my eyes open, just in case. I'm an avid outdoorsman, hunter, fisher, trapper, and more. I've been hunting and trapping and fishing in some of the same areas my entire life. I look for new places to hunt as often as possible, and am usually on the move, only returning to a stand now or an area if it has proven itself worth returning to, hence why I try and stay in the same area, but also try and explore other avenues. I'm out every day, or so, and I experience all types of weather conditions and situations throughout the year. I prefer to be as well versed in the wild as possible, and have as much knowledge about survival as possible. See, all this provides me with first-hand knowledge of all types of wildlife, their behavior, which is something many hunters rarely see. For instance, most hunters don't realize that deer will attack other animals or people when they feel threatened by them, even humans who are much bigger than them, I make my own stands at times, but mostly existing ones, or tree shacks. The majority of stands are elevated, about 6 feet off the ground, while most tree shacks are stilts, built about 12 feet above ground level. I've encountered many things in my life, but nothing like the following, which I'm going to share with you now. It's a true story that took place just this past summer. Now, it was several years, while hunting up north near North Bay, Ontario, and I saw my first Sasquatch, or Bigfoot. I'm not sure what you want to call it. I feel weird even saying that because it looked more on the canine side, but I'll let you decide. Even though I'd seen one before, it still did not prepare me for what happened. So I used trail cameras to monitor our game and to keep an eye on things in general. We're not the only ones. Even another hunter showed up one evening with his own trail camera to set up alongside ours. We'd been seeing pictures of a giant black bear for over 2 weeks now. This is when I decided to go sit in one of our tree stands at about 8 p.m. after work, and maybe I can catch a glimpse of this big brune. It wasn't long before I saw something moving around down near the base of a large poplar tree, roughly 115 yards away. Initially, I thought it was one of my hunting buddies messing around, but quickly realized that whatever it was much larger than any human, even though it appeared to be crouching or kneeling, while still behind some bush covering. I thought it could be a bear, but bears usually don't cross open areas as quickly as I was seeing this thing do, nor were there any kind of footprints of any kind in the immediate area that I noticed. I realized right away that something unusual was going on. Immediately, got my video camera out and tried to capture whatever it was on tape. The creature appeared to have long dark hair or fur covering its body, even though you couldn't see its face at first. It had been crouching behind some undergrowth, but you could tell from its size and its head that it must have been very, very large. It stood up just for a minute, looked straight in my direction, and now I could clearly see what looked like a snout and an elongated face, having blood-red eyes, and judging by the size of it, it had to have at least been over 7 feet tall, if not larger. The creature's arms were held straight down against its body while walking. To be honest, it looked like a large hairy man or a gorilla, but with the head or face of a dog. I turned on my video camera but could not get any closer. I was afraid that it would spot me or hear me coming through the deadfall between us. It also seemed to be aware that there were other hunters in the area, and made a long detour around where our tree stand was located, just before disappearing over the hill into some thicker bush cover. I estimate this thing to stand well over 7 feet tall. At no time did I see its face super clearly, but judging by how quickly it crossed an open area and the height of whatever it was, it had to be well over 7 feet. What was this thing? What does it want? We often hear of Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings, but those are usually far south of where we live. I've never seen anything like this before, and not like this, let alone in broad daylight. We also saw what appeared to be fairly fresh footprints on the following day, but couldn't find any other tracks due to the dry condition of the forest floor at that time of year. When I got home later, I searched online for any reports of Sasquatch sightings in our area. I came across one story on some cryptozoology site, written by another hunter who claimed he'd also seen one 6 years prior. I had no idea there was somebody else on here who had seen one before. We've talked about what we saw and agree on many of the details, but he says his creature was standing beside the tree where it had been kneeling when he first spotted it. Says that its shoulders were at least as high as his own, 6'4". I believe the creature I saw was different. His creature had more of a Neanderthal look, an actual bridge-nosed and a strong brow bone, whereas mine looked much more canine in the face. Well, that evening, it must have been female because ours was also much larger than his, and very tall. Not to mention the shoulders were probably close to 7 feet above the ground. I don't know what this thing is, but it looks like it can't be too far removed from us, evolutionary-wise. We've seen many different mammals in our woods over the years, including black bear. We live next to Algonquin Park, moose, white-tailed deer, and coyotes, but we've never encountered anything like this before. I guess we'll just have to keep watching and waiting for another sighting. My sighting definitely stands as bizarre, but I believe it to be a dogman. I think it would have been easier to dismiss if I'd just seen a large dog, but this thing acted very strange. It was definitely more intelligent than an average mutt. I saw it mainly from the profile as it was slowly walking away from me, looking right towards another tree, 200 yards away, across open land in a tree line. There were 4 to 5 other people with 50 feet of me on the deck. They didn't see what I saw. They were not looking in that direction at all, since it happened so quickly. It looked like something was moving around over there, but with binoculars, you could not tell exactly what. Now, at first glance, it appeared to be roughly man-sized and shaped, although too far away to make out any fine details. I was just looking at it for a few seconds, trying to figure out what I'm looking at. I had this feeling of dread about it, but also fascination, disbelief, as well as curiosity. Like something so strange should not exist on our planet, yet I am still somehow seeing it right in front of me. I don't know why, but my first thought was Bigfoot or Sasquatch. It quickly went from that to a dogman or a werewolf in my head, so very fast, there is no way it could have been anything else in hindsight. Although, honestly, if somebody asked me before today what I thought dogmen looked like, I would have said a large bear, human, or gorilla with mange. My brain just couldn't process what I was looking at. I've never seen anything that looks remotely like this thing in my life, and have no frame of reference to compare it to, in the wild. It was very strange and unnatural looking. It looked somewhat thin and gaunt, but also lean and muscular at the same time. It was definitely not overweight, fat, or bloated, as some dogman witnesses have claimed in the past, from what I've read online. If you took a typical Department of Transportation worker, wearing bright orange overalls and stood him 100 yards away, he would look something like that, only much bigger. That is how much he stood out. It all lasted for about 3 to 5 seconds, and it made this weird sound that I can't even begin to recreate for you. It was almost like a whooping sound, but not. Kind of like a mix between a whoop and a howl. And the tone was different. It was very deep and bassy. It also was accompanied by this lower rumbling growl underneath it, as if it were trying to amplify its voice and make itself louder. It's very hard to explain. I've been hunting in this area since I was a small child. I have never seen anything like that before. I should probably reiterate my statement about it standing out in bright orange clothing. I don't mean literally orange. I just mean to me that it stood out like that, where it stuck out like a sore thumb. I just thought I should clear that detail up. We also hunt deer and occasionally elk here every year from late September to mid-January. There are also tons of coyotes out here too, but they normally run away from us when we approach them. We always have shotguns and are heavily armed. We never come out here without weapons. That's just dumb. We know this thing was definitely more on edge than I have ever seen a coyote act, let alone any other kind of animal. It just had this bizarre look about it, a strange demeanor that seemed very out of place in the northern Michigan woods. I grew up hunting and fishing with my father every year since I was old enough to walk. I'm not too fazed by encountering something rare or unusual while outdoors, due to all the crazy stuff I have seen over the years. This is why I am so confident in what I saw, albeit an extremely rare and unusual thing to see for sure. The whole thing lasted around 7 seconds total before it disappeared behind another tree line at the edge of the property. Then, it was gone from sight. There were a few other hunters within 50 feet of me. After this sighting, I actually returned back to the same location about a week or 10 days later. Maybe I would encounter it again, or maybe I would encounter it while white-tailed deer hunting in my family's tree stand. But all I saw was a cougar across the field about 200 plus yards away. Quite odd here again in northern Michigan. We don't really have many mountain lions here at all, or anywhere else for that matter. But I never saw this strange dog thing again. I wonder what it could have been. The only thing I could think of is I've heard reports of the Michigan dogman, but I know very little about it. Is that possibly what I witnessed? My father and I were hunting west of Northumberland, Pennsylvania, on some state land. We had been out for a couple of hours when we decided to head back to the truck. It was just after dark, as we had been hunting since 4 a.m. that morning. We headed down a logging road towards the parking area, where my dad's truck was parked off a side road. To get there was about a mile walk through some pretty dense forest, away from the nearest power line cut, so you couldn't see anything until you reached it. As we got closer, we saw something moving up ahead on our left, but at first did not pay much attention. There are usually deer in this area, which moves around sometimes before starting their evening feeding activity. However, as we got closer, it became apparent that this was no deer. It was about 6 to 7 feet tall, estimate only, with very broad shoulders and completely covered in reddish-brown hair, standing up on 2 legs. There was no hocks on the leg at all either. This was distinctly human, in every sense of the word. Just seeing the sight of this made your hair stand on end. Nearing around 1 o'clock a.m., while hunting on state land, my father heard something moving towards him at a fast pace amongst the heavy brush to his right side. He immediately got his rifle up, looked for whatever was making all the noise, but could not see anything. He slowly began to back away, trying to get around some nearby trees without cutting himself off from where I was at. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, an animal came bursting out of the brush, its left side, heading straight for him. It came so close to him, he could feel its hot breath on his left side, before my father ended up stumbling backwards and fell over a downed tree. The animal bluff charged my father. It stopped about 5 feet from him. We have every reason to believe that this was a Dogman or werewolf sighting, due to the following things. Number 1. The size of it. 6 to 7 feet tall with very broad shoulders, completely covered in dark hair, standing upright, and looking very, very canine. Number 2. Its speed. This thing moved abnormally fast. Too fast for a man or a woman in a suit, and faster than a deer or any other known animal. Number 3. It acted like no other wild animal we have seen before. Deer, bear, elk, turkey, etc. They will all typically either run away or charge you if they feel threatened, especially if humans are directly between them and the direction they want to go, or food, for example. But this animal, it stopped after it had my father partially surrounded. It was like it wasn't afraid of him at all, even though he's 6 foot tall and 280 pounds with a .30-06 rifle. Number 4. The fact that it came out of nowhere without any warning. We don't know why it didn't attack, but chose to bluff charge instead. But we do know that the other animals won't simply not give you any warning before attacking. So I'm certain that this leads me to believe the only logical answer is that this creature, whatever it was, didn't want to. Number 5. This animal is no known native North American species of mammal. There are no sirens located out here. I have never heard a sound like that out here, or anywhere before. And we've all heard stories of Sasquatch being out here, but I'm skeptical of this stuff, and joke about it usually on every outing. I thought it was unusual, but Bigfoot was definitely not my first answer as to what we saw. Number 6. The distinct smell. This thing smelt like rotting flesh, wet dog, and blood. My father claims it is the worst smell he's ever had in his life. And number 7. This animal continued on past my father after they made eye contact for about 10 seconds, showing no fear or aggression towards him whatsoever. It just kept moving on through the trees with its back to him by at least 40 feet away, looking right at him while it moved. Then, it went behind some trees and disappeared from sight, all while staying completely and utterly silent. I think this thing knew exactly what we were, but was uninterested in us for whatever reason. I'm sure if we had tried to shoot at it with our rifles while standing there, it probably would have had a much different reaction. It did stop about 5 feet from me, standing there looking at me, like it was sizing me up, determining if it wanted to eat me. Although I did have my rifle trained on it the whole time, but was shaking so bad from being so close to this thing, I didn't even know if I could hit it or not. My father jumped up after he fell over the tree, stood between it and myself. The animal looked at him briefly, turned its head back towards me, still standing there and passively staring directly at me again, with no aggression whatsoever, still just kind of sizing me up. After maybe another 20 grueling seconds, it slowly turned away from us, moving through some low-hanging branches into the woods again without any noise, for the second time. I think it just stared at us, studied us, as if it decided that it didn't want to mess with us, and left. Afterwards, the forest was dead silent, not a noise, and after about 30 seconds, the noise began to slowly fade back, just enough time for us to turn around and track our path back to the way we came. We didn't sleep much that night. We went back to where we saw this thing in the morning, but all that was there was some huge footprints in an area of really soft soil, very large canine prints, which we failed to cast. We did find one set of tracks, but they kind of stopped after a while. They were not Bigfoot, they were not bear, they were unlike any tracks I'd seen before. Now these tracks were also probably about 10 inches long and 6 inches wide, with a stride of nearly 4 feet. This was definitely the creature we had seen. You can even see the massive indent in the soft ground from how heavy this was. This is exactly where we saw the thing walk, and exactly what this creature was. The footprints went out deep into the brush and disappeared, leading me to believe that this creature is roaming out here for a long time. We are 100% certain that this was not a Bigfoot or anything else that has been talked about for decades now. The reason I decided to come forward with my story is there's no way to know how many of these things are out here, and the encounter did not really feel too threatening. Me and my father believe it was curious about our presence, but uninterested in conflict. It felt like it wanted us out, but not to a confliction level. Maybe it was more curious. We were also completely alone during this experience, which makes me confident that we weren't just seeing something normal. Again, we did not feel any malice coming from it. We were not afraid that we might be harmed by this thing. It felt like we were being observed and thoroughly checked out to see if we were a threat. I know what we saw. Unless you've been there yourself, you will never know really. My wife and I were traveling north on Highway 1 to do some camping, about 20 miles south of Sacramento in the early evening time. We estimate sometime after 9 p.m. We passed a curve in the road, and we both simultaneously noticed something to our right, about 1 kilometer away, standing right off the roadside. We could see it very clearly. There were no fences or woods blocking our view. Neither of us said anything at first. I think we were in shock, but then we each started asking each other, "Did you see that?" We were both in total disbelief. I had to turn around and go back, which made me a little nauseous. This thing was such a strange sight. It looked like some kind of very tall, 8 to 9 foot tall, man-like creature on 2 legs, with very hairy, dark, black-brown skin. It was facing us with its right side toward the road, its left shoulder slightly closer to us. It seemed like it had long hair, but it was matted in some places and not in the others. If there had ever been a real-life living werewolf, we were seeing it. Now, there are 2 other stories about this creature. One is an encounter by a hiker that I know of, which I will include later on. The other is an encounter by a couple. She said, this creature looked like something out of The Hobbit. Very long arms, very fantasy, very bushy hair, and very just strange looking. It looked more ape-like than human, she said. A very long snout, exaggerated features, and very large black eyes. It was very creepy looking. It too observed her as she was walking to her mailbox in the morning, before going back behind a tree and disappearing. She said she totally got the creeps. Her and I were so freaked out, we didn't even pull over either. As for myself and my wife, we drove very fast back into town, telling the police what we saw. Now my other friend who was hiking claims that he was driving through the woods when he sees this tall, dark creature walking into the road in front of him. He began to slow down and stared at it intently before realizing this wasn't human, nor was it somebody casually walking around in a costume. It then turned around and glared menacingly at him through glowing red eyes. At this point, he was completely panic-stricken, flooring it, and did not stop or care about hitting it until he was several kilometers away from the scene. I do understand that others have made reports about the creature making a strange howling sound. I also know of 2 other people who say they saw one. I'm unsure if they are being honest. They just seemed very off to me for some reason, and I can't say why. I have been back to that spot several times since then, but never had the guts to get out of my car and go look around in the area where we saw it. I truly believe we saw something that night, but I don't think it was a Bigfoot. This is just my opinion, though. In March of 1991, I was returning home after one night. I was not far into my journey when suddenly, in front of me on the road, I see a large black animal that stands completely upright and crosses the road. It actually ran across the road in a very nocturnal fashion, staying to the shadows as much as possible. I immediately stopped my car and turned off the engine so that I could listen for it to come back. But after a few moments, I saw that there was no chance of that ever happening. As I looked at the place where it had been standing in front of my car, I couldn't believe what I saw, coming from over the road ahead and going into the woods on the other side. I saw the head and shoulders of another black animal that was also running into the forest. I believe this was a different one. It ran past a lighted area on the side of the road that comes from a house, which I could just see faintly in the distance. The speed at which it ran would suggest its size to be over 8 feet tall, not counting the head and shoulder length. I think it was pretty broad. The shoulder width of this animal appeared to be as large as the height of my car, and I'm not a big man at 6'3". Its head seemed to be held high, and it appeared to have long hair hanging down from its back and belly, but not from the back area or shoulders. It didn't look like it was carrying anything in its arms, but it may have had something around its chest, which was hard to make out. The light was behind this creature and was not super bright. This all happened very quickly. I probably only saw the animal for less than a total of 5 seconds before it ran completely out of sight, deep into the tree line. I only had a very short window of opportunity to see this animal, as it was moving from my right-hand side into my left-hand field of view, and I had to swerve slightly with the car in order to keep it in sight. It happened so quickly that I could not even tell if it was on all fours, or if it had been standing up the entire time. All I know is that it ran very quickly, at a speed which was too fast to have ever been human, or somebody out there in a suit, that's for sure. I've heard of skinwalkers before, but I'm not sure that's what this was. I'm reaching out to you first to see if maybe that's what I saw, or if it was something else entirely. So, I was 17 years old, fishing in a town called Fernley, Nevada. It's basically in the middle of nowhere with lots of open land and only one tree-lined canals for houses. I was with 2 friends at my house near one canal ends and another starts. That's about 2 miles away from civilization, and all 3 of us saw what looked like a large 6-foot-tall werewolf walking along the tree line of the canal. It was light at the time, but it had just begun to go to dusk, so everything was still very visible. It moved extremely fast and very fluid-like, with no discernible gait. We all saw the same thing, and I know both of my friends will admit it to you if you ask them. We all saw it, and we were all absolutely terrified. We ran home. I tried looking for tracks or footprints, but didn't find anything matching what we'd seen. I'm not saying that I saw a werewolf, but maybe something like one. It could be completely fabrication of memory as well, though, which is why I'm reaching out to you. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I swear this is true. And until recently, probably because I haven't thought about it for years, I was absolutely convinced that I had seen something supernatural that night. Any information would be great. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thanks. My brother and I hunt the turkeys out here every spring. Have been, since we were both young boys. This time, I think this large wolf had eaten most of them, or so we thought. Our neighbor is a wolf hunter, and he said there was no wolves around. This hunt, we were coming home the same way every time, so I decided to take another path. We didn't see anything unusual until I noticed down in this swale, they call a creek here, some really, really big animal tracks. They looked like my boots for size, but long and narrow. The hair on them wasn't as coarse as a dog or a coyote, but much more fine, with each print almost perfectly placed side by side from one another. Followed those tracks until they went out of sight. They ended at a good-sized pile of fresh dirt, about the size of a grave, if you ask me, but there was nothing there except that it had been dug up before. There was the end of my path. Went back home to get my shovel, and found nothing. I've seen lots of wolves in this area, but nothing like what they look like, or those tracks were left by. We've seen this thing before in another part of the state, in West Virginia, when we were also turkey hunting years ago. We heard something in the woods, and it was somebody running through. It came crashing out of the brush, and snorted at us. Looked like a large chimpanzee or something with long arms and a thick body, but a head that was kind of like a dog or a coyote's. It was really strange looking. Never seen anything before or since that can explain it. I even seen this thing run across a road one time, leaving a bar I used to work at after dark, going from the city to the county line. It took me a sec to figure out what I was looking at, of how darn fast it moved, even for being so big. When you see stuff like that, you don't forget it easy. It still creeps me out thinking about it. I don't know the whole story, but I guess they arrested a guy for killing people and placing them in various spots. They didn't show photos of him, so you don't see his picture, and I guess he was very hairy and had an extremely abnormal face with red eyes. But there were no reports or pictures that looked like those tracks we seen, which were nothing like a bear or dog tracks either. And no, they were not large human tracks, aka Bigfoot. I wish now, though, that I would have followed those tracks further, to see where they ended, as far as a den site. I think every time we heard anything back there, it was probably some kind of animal with human DNA messing around. Never took time to find out, though, what it was. All signs point to this thing being really newsworthy. In 2011, I got a report from a trucker who reported seeing this strange upright walking canine that he describes looking just like a werewolf. This is his story. I was at a truck stop in Delaware and had parked facing the interstate where I could get satellite TV and sleeping in my cab. It was roughly 3:34 a.m. I remember. I had just glanced over at the clock before this happened. So I turned off all the interior lights so it would be dark, but not enough for me to go to sleep just yet. Just after turning off all my lights, I happened to look out over where people park and saw something blackish and gray, about 6 feet tall, moving very fast from the timber and swamplands into a patch of super thick brush. And right when I was starting to think, what the heck is that, I heard what would be about 75 yards or so away further be like a very, very large dog, like growl, bark, or roar. And it literally made me instantly terrified. I pulled out my puny pocket knife. It's all I had. And slowly, I sat there by myself in the cab of my truck, thinking, who am I going to talk to? Who's going to believe me? Who's not going to see me as a total nutjob? So I decided to just turn on my lights and leave. I've been hunting since I was 9. I'm 27 now, and I know for certain this was no raccoon or coyote or anything or like any other animals around here. This also includes the rare cougar, which the DNR says does not exist around here. But I know good reliable people who have seen them. And I looked up every cougar call and sound I could find. Nothing comes even remotely close to it. I'm not scared of anything in the woods, but I know we're not supposed to have blackish gray, 6-foot-tall upright animals in this county. I'm pretty well confused about the whole thing, and the first time in my life I've been actually scared of the forest. Yeah, I got a good look at the thing, even though it only lasted for a few seconds. But it looked like a flipping werewolf. It was maybe 100 yards from me, but I could see it perfectly in the darkish moonlight. Even though it wasn't that bright out, I saw enough to scare me. Hello. I have a couple of more stories to share with you. This one was sent in many years ago. It's by a gentleman who wants to remain anonymous, but told his harrowing story about how he was attacked when elk hunting out in Utah. Here's the story. I was elk hunting in Utah one time back when I was about 20 years old. It was the fall of the year, and I'd been camping there for a while. One night, after going to sleep, my dogs started going crazy, barking at something outside my camper. At first, I thought it might have been a bear trying to get into my trash. So I got up, grabbed a flashlight and handgun, just in case anything did happen to be out there that shouldn't be. It's never a good thing to assume unless you know for sure without any doubt. So I opened up the door to my camper and looked outside, looking around everywhere with the beam from my flashlight, scanning over everything, until suddenly, something large dropped down from the trees above and landed right behind me. I stood there in complete and total shock, looking at a creature now standing about 8 feet away from me. Long gangly arms and hands, almost down to its knees, claws looking like knives, and a face looking like the werewolf from American Werewolf in London. The light from my flashlight highlighting every feature on its face perfectly. This was terror incarnate. It's like if you took a man and mixed it with a wolf. That's exactly what I was looking at. Around its neck, I'll never forget, it had this large, thick black mane, the same way a lion does. But if this thing is not a killing machine, I don't know what is. I stood there for just a few seconds that felt like an eternity, trying to process what I was seeing. Was this real or not? It quickly grinned at me, like it wanted me to see it, just to be terrorized, and quickly backstepped and vanished in the shadows. The only thing unusual about the way it sprinted and disappeared so quick is it did not use its arms or hands, like it did not go down on its fours. It actually stepped back on 2 legs like a man would. Anyway, after all this took place, my dogs began going crazy again, barking louder than ever before at something else outside in the dark. I knew that thing was still lingering. I was terrified. I turned off all my lights, shutting and locking the door, crawling back into bed alone, keeping my handgun fully loaded and the safety off, ready for war at any moment. As I lay there in silence, trying to get some sleep after that bizarre and terrifying encounter with a living nightmare, just before magically dozing off to sleep, an extremely loud, high-pitched scream came from somewhere very close by outside in the woods. It sounded like something you would expect if somebody or something got hurt very badly. Now, I want to reiterate that this event took place many years ago, and if I can't remember if it was a man's voice I heard or something else entirely, so let me tell you about what happened the next day to my camper. I went outside to see what might have happened at first light, but unfortunately, somebody of incredible size and strength had taken my truck and turned it on its side, smashing out all my windows with their fists, tearing off both driver's side doors, ripping up all my seats, and breaking the steering wheel. But what was most disturbing, beyond all that, was whatever did it also spent some time trying to stomp out any evidence that it had left behind, covering most of the tracks with its own feet, which is why there were so many incredibly large canine footprints beyond my trailer. I had to have a buddy come pick me up. There was no way I could report this to any police. Nobody would believe me. But there was another weird thing about that night that happened also, and it really bothers me. There were numerous large mounds of dirt buried over everywhere. I thought they were somewhere like something dug up from the ground, possibly from burrowing underground someplace. That's unusual. Is it possible that this thing had been burrowing tunnels underneath the ground, making these long, elaborate tunnels that it lived in? Maybe something evil lived within them, whatever this creature was. That morning, I got chased out of that camper by whatever it was. Yet, another story to share with you. This one dates back to 2016 when a family goes camping in Colorado. They are stalked by a dogman. Here's their story. My wife and kids were all sitting around the campfire at our campsite. It was roughly about 10 p.m. now. We had already finished cooking and were sitting around the fire, telling stories and just enjoying ourselves. All of us were facing inward, looking toward the fire and each other, when my daughter had asked me why I was staring off into the woods behind her. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I assumed she would follow my gaze to see what I was looking at, when she did not respond. But instead, she said, "Dad, what are you looking at over there?" I quickly realized that there must be something standing just outside of the firelight behind her. When I looked back over her shoulder, which is where the rest of my family was seated as well, I believed I saw a large upright canine standing about 30 feet away. It would have been about 7 or 8 feet tall on all fours if it had been standing next to the log that was closest to us, which appeared to be resting. Its fur was long, more of a dark blonde than red. A couple of seconds after, I first focused on it, it stood up on 2 legs and walked out into the center. My sister screamed as I instinctively threw my arm over her and pulled her tightly against me with my left hand, cupping over her mouth so she wouldn't attract its attention with any further screaming. Seeing an unkempt human-looking creature, the body shape and posture of a large man with an animal's head is in fact very terrifying. The face was also very dog-like, but longer, kind of like that of a gray wolf, with the body more similar and akin to that of a silverback gorilla. It was sort of hunched over and ran, stopped and turned its head toward us before disappearing into the thicket. Its fur was a lot more gray than I thought. A lot more gray. We were quiet and still for a few minutes before we both decided to get up and run back to my parents' vehicle. Fortunately, this creature appeared entirely uninterested in us, and which is probably why it didn't pursue us when we ran away. I can only speculate that it lived out here because nobody would hear you scream. The nearest house or cabin was miles away, and at first glance, I thought it was maybe an old man walking through the trees towards me, but I could see how canine it looked. Another thing, its head was also very disproportionately large for its body. It reminded me of a video game or something. But its claws were humongous. The way it was grasping the log, looking back, it's like they probably weren't meant for tearing up deer. They were probably meant for tearing up big prey. We packed up everything very quickly, and we headed out of there very fast. I was not going to sit there with my family and waste more time around whatever large creature this was, and risk potentially being devoured. I have never heard of Bigfoot being in Wisconsin. I'm pretty well confused about the whole thing, and the first time in my life scared of the forest. I don't think what I'm dealing with, though, is a Bigfoot. This thing looks like a giant wolf. When I killed it, it kind of fell over sideways, like when you shoot a deer in the side, but this thing must have weighed easily 400 pounds. I'm wondering if somebody's trying to beat me out of my chicken coop and wanted something big enough to scare me away. Anyway, let me explain. One night, I'm not sure what time, but I was driving west down the road. This runs along the south side of the Army ammunitions plant property. It's just after midnight, and I come around a curve about 3/4 a mile past K-13 gate, when suddenly, there are 4 creatures off to my right, standing in some scrub grass beside the road, maybe 10 feet away. They made no noise, but immediately ran across the road into an area of tall weeds on my left shoulder. I would guess at least 8 feet high. My first thought was deer, so I slowed down initially, waiting for them to cross back over, when I realized these were giant wolves. They jumped from their hiding place between me and a drainage ditch. I actually ended up running over the first one. I don't think it was dead, but not moving for sure. I fishtailed my car trying to get away from them, and that's when I got stuck in the weeds. I didn't know what was going on until I saw them sitting on side of my driver's side, looking at me. They were very tall, covered with hair. I would guess 5 inches long all over their bodies. They stared at me intently with their deep, glowing eyes. I was convinced they were going to rip me out of the car and tear me to pieces right then and there. Their eyes just stayed lit up, as if they illuminated light. These things, I cannot tell you how sinister they looked. They showed no fear of man. That surprised me. Look, I've got 3 kids and work for a major bread company. I have no reason to make this up, so you can see how strange this was. Luckily, just as they approached my car, A large semi in the oncoming lane began coming, which scared them all off. They looked in the direction of the lights and ran towards the other side of the road. When the semi got close to me, he slowed down, got out, and offered me help. We both observed the dead wolf in the center of the road. This one was much smaller than the other ones we were seeing. I'm assuming maybe it was a juvenile or a young one. I don't know. But it was pretty mangled up. I just remember the truck driver giving me his name and information, and we both looked at the corpse saying, "What is this thing?" But not much else came from that. Easily one of the scariest nights of my life. A witness who wished to remain anonymous claims to have seen a creature that was not native to the area during the mid-evening hours of September 26, 1988. The creature was reported to have been about 5 feet tall, bipedal, with gray fur. It also had very long arms with very long claws. It was also very lean in the chest and stomach, but the legs were more leaner. The witness claims that it made a noise similar to an old air raid siren. The story is that a young man who wishes to remain anonymous spotted a strange canine-like creature on Easter Sunday of 1992. He describes it as being between 7 and 9 feet tall, having red eyes and lanky arms, almost reaching the ground. The body is very hairy with heads similar to those of canines. The arms were much thinner and more human-like than those of an ape. There were no apparent hands or claws that he saw. It was also reported as having a very large head with slanted eyes and a jaw that jutted out from the rest of its face. It has also been described as having been extremely powerful looking, which led to it being compared to King Kong by the witness. He stated that it had between half and 3/4 of a mile away from his vantage point, but he was able to see it very clearly with his binoculars. It appeared again at about 9:30 a.m. for about an hour, disappearing behind the foliage. The witness also claims that 2 other people around the same area saw the creature as well during this time period. One of those claimed to have seen what they described as either a bipedal Bigfoot or Sasquatch. It was like a Bigfoot, they said, but it had a face like a dog. The third person claimed to have witnessed the canine-like creature as well, who is now deceased. Sightings along Salt Creek have been going on for years, leading many residents to believe that there is indeed something strange going on within this small, rural community in Ohio. This was in Pennsylvania, 55 miles south of Pittsburgh. December 26, 1991. 3 motorists had more than a traffic stop on their minds when they reported seeing what appeared to be the legendary werewolf, all along Route 40, west of town, Wednesday afternoon. 2 women and a man phoned state police at Union Township early Thursday to report the creature about 4 p.m., just west of Route 21 in Guysville. According to Trooper Thomas Epler, who took the call from the woman, the motorist said it was a dark gray, lupine-like figure, about 7 feet tall with a powerful build. They all gave the same description, Epler said Thursday night, adding that they were shaken by the encounter. The one lady was getting off Route 21 and saw it down in a field on her side of the road, in Guysville, he said. She slowed up to get a better look. The woman told police she saw what appeared to be a big dog or wolf standing on its hind legs, munching on something dead. Then, walk on 2 legs into a wooded area near some railroad tracks, completely visible. She described its gait as very stiff and awkward once it left the field and headed towards the woods along Route 40. Moments later, the woman told police she came upon a car parked along Route 40 and a man standing next to it talking on a cell phone. He was obviously shaken, told her that he had just called state police about seeing the beast himself moments earlier in the same location, Epler said. The trooper, who was not aware of that report, then took a call from another woman, asking if anything had been found in the area. She gave me a similar description, Epler said, of the second caller's account. She reported seeing an apparent dog or wolf running across Route 40 from Guysville toward Uniontown as they drove west toward town Wednesday afternoon near Sheet's convenience store at Route 21 and Route 40. She said it looked like a big dog or wolf with thick, shaggy, hairy fur. Epler said of the second report that he received from a woman early Thursday morning. He said both women described seeing an animal about 7 to 8 feet tall walking on its hind legs as it walked through a small field west of Route 40 and Sheet's store toward Uniontown along Guysville Road. Both ladies were very nervous and concerned, Epler said, adding that police had no idea what they were dealing with Wednesday night, since no tracks were found in the area where witnesses saw a large gray creature on 2 legs near railroad tracks off of Route 40, just outside the city limits of Union on Wednesday afternoon, right around 4 p.m. While it may turn out to be some type of prank, Epler said, police were taking the calls very seriously and had no idea what they were dealing with, without any physical evidence such as tracks or droppings of the scene. We received a report last year on this date about hunters seeing something similar in the same area, but we had nothing here today. Epler said the first caller estimated the creature stood 7 feet tall and was munching on a dead deer carcass on Wednesday afternoon when she first spotted it on her westbound side of the Route 40, just past the Sheet's store near an overpass for Interstate 70, which again is adjacent to Route 40, outside of Uniontown city limits, off of Guysville Road. Epler noted that there was one apparent set of tracks found near where the second woman had reported an animal crossing Route 40 Wednesday afternoon, just outside the city limits, but they were very indistinct and unconfirmed by police who had no idea what type of tracks they were dealing with. The troopers said the second woman told him that she returned home from work late Wednesday night and found her yard torn up, as if something large had been thrashing around it. We have no idea what made those tracks, adding that investigators would be checking local scrap yards for any recent purchases of metal bear traps to see if they might have a clue about who or what it was. People are telling us this one weird deal, Epler said, noting that there were no dead deer in the area where witnesses said something was feasting on its remains. To this day, it still remains a mystery. I was walking down the road in my town. I live on a corner, so there's 2 main roads leading to my house. One that faces west, and another that faces south. Well, it was fall in late October, probably around 4 or 5 at night. I had just got off work, and figured I would walk home rather than sit around for an hour waiting for the bus when I could be walking instead. After all, it's a much healthier alternative. It isn't too far from work to home, which is about 3/4 of a mile, maybe, but it can still make you sweaty, especially in the heat. Anyway, back to the story. I was approaching this particular intersection when I saw something weird out of my peripherals, running along the tree line behind 2 houses across the street from mine. I didn't think much of it at first. I just thought it was some random person, but as soon as my brain registered the fact that it wasn't human, fear punched me in the chest and mind simultaneously. It ran on all 4s, but its posture was hunched back, like a hyena or a dog. Only the arms were longer than the hind legs. The shoulders were hunched very high up near its ears with long gangly arms, kind of dragging against the ground, even though they seemed to be extending all the way down to its toes. Its head looked practically horizontal compared to most animals, if not more so, considering it had a large snout. Its fur was very white, all over, except for certain areas which displayed grays ranging from white to tan. After it passed by the last house with a tree blocking my full view, it stopped, turned its head to look at my direction, or more accurately, I should say it. There was no actual face I could clearly see, just black empty space. This is all I managed to get out of myself before fear dragged me into full-blown panic and took off running for my life up the road leading northward, away from this beast. I didn't want to leave the main road, so I decided to take a shortcut through somebody's yard, who had several pine trees in their backyard which were not visible from either the sidewalk or the street. They didn't pose much threat as far as lack of visibility went. As soon as I was in the yard, and safe from the beast's view, I turned around to see if it had decided to want to chase me. What I saw can only be described as a nightmare. It was maybe 50 feet behind me, just standing there, looking at me, with the same empty stare. In hindsight, I know it couldn't have been much taller than maybe 6 feet. But when you feel you're being hunted by a creature of nightmares, what you see is not always what is real. Now I'm running again at this point. Fear has kicked my survival instincts into overdrive, and I'm sprinting through the backyard, trying to find some way out of the situation. Frantic. Anything, even an electric fence would do. Well, wouldn't you know it? But they don't have one, so I'm still trapped. In a moment of pure unadulterated desperation, I start climbing the first pine tree that isn't too far from me. Pine trees have always been my favorite kind of tree to climb as a kid, and so this made it easy for me. I get about halfway up, and I hear something crashing through the underbrush, coming closer. As it got louder and louder, I saw about 30 feet below me, it just standing there, staring up at me again, with these large black eyes, like it was waiting for me to come down, slowly tilting its head downwards, looking back up at me. It's like its eyes were piercing into my soul like daggers into a heart. I did not come down to that tree for more than 20 minutes. It did eventually leave, but it felt like I was stuck up there for an eternity. I don't know if this thing just got bored of me or what, but it's not like I stayed up there looking down at it. I took my view off of it and just prayed and prayed and prayed, hoping, wishing it would leave. I looked down eventually and it was gone. I don't know if it was going to pounce on me the second I got down there or what. Maybe it was a trap. Maybe it was waiting for me. I had to go down eventually. And at this point, I absolutely had to get home somehow, even though it meant running past the beast again. I couldn't stay up in this tree forever. Eventually, I was going to have to come down sometime and face my fears head on, like a man. The only problem is there were no branches lower than 5 feet from the ground, except for the one right next to me, but it looked too weak and brittle with sharp edges, which would make getting down very difficult to do safely. Right when I decided to climb back down was my best option. Another pine cone fell from above, nearly hitting me in the head. After hanging out here for about another hour, and making sure the beast was not around, I convinced myself to climb back down, running fast back to home, as fast as my legs could carry me, which was quite a speed considering I hadn't run that fast since middle school gym class. I got home and was safe and sound, immediately locking every door and window I had. Now it's been several months since this encounter, but every once in a while when I walk through the forest alone at night, or even take a shortcut through somebody's backyard, I could still see those empty black eyes staring back at me from somewhere in the trees. At first, they spooked me, but now it's like they're a part of my daily nightmares. They're just something that will forever haunt my soul. I'm fairly certain this was either a werewolf or a skinwalker. I was driving on a country road at night with my mother past an intersection near some fields. The field had a very faint path cut through by a fence post, and as I looked out in the window, I saw something from the corner of my eye go from those posts to the right towards another dirt road, more or less parallel with ours. It was roughly 7 feet tall and lanky, but moved very fast for its size without giving off any sound. Its movements were smooth but yet stiff at the same time, like somebody dancing who didn't quite know how to move their body properly. It definitely was not limber. It was too dark for me to see all the details well enough, and I couldn't make out anything very specific. And it happened so quickly. I am certain that it wasn't human, nor the classic lumbering man-wolf description of some Bigfoot sightings. I told my mother, but she didn't believe me until I showed her the route it took on our map near our route moments after it happened. She drove down that road herself, found only the small dirt track perpendicular to ours, along with another similar track leading off into an area of older cornfields, which is where I saw this thing start out from. We were the only car around for miles, and this thing was running pretty fast, so it had to have crossed both our paths to get where I saw it go. I don't know what this was or if this could have even been considered a cryptid sighting, since we didn't see anything really other than its movement. But it's one of those things you don't forget. It was not a human, and it was not an ape or monkey either, as far as I'm concerned. All that said, though, I'm not convinced either way whether such creatures exist or not. There is little material out there that goes beyond just telling stories about them, and making up flimsy theories based on bad math and wishful thinking. Maybe something like a skinwalker or a werewolf really does exist, but that's not enough. We need specific data, and more reliable eyewitness accounts from multiple sources before we could make any real progress on the matter. Until then, this was just an interesting, if brief encounter with something unknown in the darkness to add to my very short list of experiences other than spooky noises and shadows. I was traveling southbound on I-25 around midnight, and I saw something which stood up in front of me. It was very dark, and due to my high beams, I could see it pretty clearly. There were no other cars at the time. The thing looked like an ape and a canine made a baby, and it had very large teeth and kind of green glowing eyes. Its hands did not look human or animal either, for that matter. Just long claws, and if I was to place a description for the hands, they reminded me of raccoon hands. That's all I really remember about it before it ran off into the woods, along the side of the road over a ditch. As my car got closer to it, it evaded. This was one of the scariest things I've ever seen in my life. This happened at the entrance of the campgrounds at the Bosque del Apache Wildlife Refuge. There were skid marks in mud, where whatever spilled seemed recently abandoned by whatever creature had dropped it while running from us. There was also a man, a traveler, who lived all of his life until death in solitude. His only connection with other humans was through an old post office box chained to a metal pole just outside of town. This one, I'm going to say, is a little harder to swallow, but I knew what I saw. It also happened back in 2014 in the winter, when myself and 3 other friends were out camping in a spot we knew from fishing trips. We were camping in a spot south of Reed Point, about 10 miles off of 287 south on the edge of Blacktail Creek Wildlife Refuge. The sun had gone down earlier that evening, and we're sitting around a fire, listening to music and drinking beer, and one of my buddies was going to bed in his tent. Another friend went over to help him get situated because it was pretty cold outside. So after another beer or two, I decided it would be a good idea for me to try and get some sleep as well. We all heard some strange screeching that night, that my friend claims was the howling of a werewolf. Nothing really much happened beyond that, but it's still pretty terrifying. I got a couple of things for you. People have often noticed odd things while driving on some of the New Mexico's interstates, but there are 3 specific stretches of road where the strangeness just seems to be far more prevalent than others. I don't know if it was a werewolf or not, but I do remember being in the passenger seat of my friend's car on his way home from work at about 3 in the morning, since we carpooled often. We were heading westbound on I-40, approaching the Wagon Mount exit, and we both saw something standing next to a tree alongside the interstate. The creature seemed to be staring at us and began growling and barking like a dog would. However, although its face looked canine, it looked distorted and was standing upright the way a man would. It also had a very lanky body. It was very strange. I'm not sure if that's what a werewolf is, but my friend and I definitely know what we saw. Also, I was in my family house in 2011 with my brother, and we heard a noise in the backyard of our 2-story house. We didn't think much about it until we went outside and spotted something black running up the hillside in the distance. My dad and I tried to follow it but lost sight of it just before it got out of our view. It looked very similar to a very large dog, except for its hair was longer, and its long pointed ears made me think it wasn't just a big dog after all. The next day, we found weird canine tracks all the way around our back property, leading down to the small creek and up the hill where we saw it the night before. It was pretty creepy. While I'm mountain biking through very thick timberline, I looked down and saw an area where somebody had made a fire, so I went over to it, got off my bike and started looking at the ashes, when suddenly, I heard crackling brush about 50 yards away from me. It sounded like something was coming straight towards me through the brush. When I turned around, all I could see was black fur sticking out of the brush, until whatever it was emerged from between 2 trees, then taking off, running into the forest again. I'm 6'3". This thing was huge, blackish gray with long shaggy hair. Looked like it could have been on its hind legs, but only for a few seconds. It must have followed me to my bike. When I turned around, there it was, standing to me, growling, before taking off again. This is the second time something like this has happened to me in all these years of writing here. I don't believe in werewolves, but this thing looked just like one. It was terrifying. I do believe they exist now, and I'm not going back there ever again. The only thing I can come up with is that I potentially was on its territory, and it did not like that. I've been a long-time hiker and outdoors type person. I've done it all, I've seen it all too, with the exception of a couple of strange sightings that I've had over the years. I'll tell you about them. On the first Saturday of September, I went out on a solo hike in what is probably my favorite place to go hiking, Cave Run State Park, located just outside of Moorhead, Kentucky. It's about 25 miles from Lexington, and it's quite popular with outdoor people. The scenery is serene and beautiful. Every year during Labor Day weekend, there are several large gatherings of outdoor people who camp out there for the weekend at the same park. And since it was the last full weekend of summer, according to my calendar, I thought it would be fun to see what all these outdoorsy types were up to. As I hiked along one of the trails that goes around part of this big lake, I noticed some folks gathered near the water, further down the trail where they had some spread out like picnic blankets and were eating lunch. Some of the people had already changed into their swimming apparel, heading down towards the water to take a swim in the lake, with most of them jumping off one of those big rock cliffs that are located right along the shore. After I hiked for a while longer, I decided it would be nice to go for a swim myself. So I climbed up onto the trail, put my wallet and other items in a waterproof baggie, took off my clothes down to my bathing suit. The first thing I did was go over to the water's edge, where all these folks were gathered, enjoying themselves splashing each other with water, or sitting around just chit-chatting. Just as I was about to jump off this big cliff into the water, I heard a thump right behind me. I turned around to see what it was. There, not more than 40 feet from me, were two very large creatures standing there on the trail. Our eyes met, and they both started kind of hollering at each other, making some strange clicking noises. I don't know if you've ever seen a real-life living werewolf before, but these things played the part very well. I just reacted. I jumped off the small cliff into the water below. Assuming they had followed behind me, I turned and they weren't there when I surfaced. So I quickly swam to the nearest shore, which happened to be just past these folks who were picnicking. When I started out for that direction, both of those things too, I can hear them up there, up on the cliffside, yelping and making these strange howling noises. This got the attention of everybody around me. Now people were concerned and looking up, and I fled back to the trail where I originally came from, and I tried to stay low to the ground, hiding behind the trees and dodging as best I could. Surprisingly, they didn't jump in after me, like they still wanted to remain hidden of some kind. It was very strange how they just appeared there. I don't know if they were trying to communicate to me or what. They didn't seem incredibly aggressive, but I instantly felt fear and dread. Like, had I not jumped off the cliff, had I not reacted, they would have torn me to pieces. Even in the distance, I could still hear them yapping and howling and clicking. And a bunch of people who were just casually hanging out were all pointing and hearing these sounds, trying to talk amongst themselves and wonder what it was. I'm not the only one who's had this sighting. There are many other hikers around here. In fact, some are even my friends who have reported strange, werewolf-like looking creatures that live in these woods that will sometimes surprise hikers. There have even been hikers who have actually been physically assaulted and attacked. One man having nearly lost his arm, while another was blinded, having this thing torn out his eye. Of course, we all know that a lot of this stuff is heavily covered up, so you probably won't hear about it, and don't expect to find much online. They don't allow that much information to get out. Bad PR is bad PR. Parks won't handle that. But I'm sure you're wanting probably more of a fair description of what I saw. It's really hard for me to, because I'll be as clear and plain as day with you. If you've ever seen a werewolf from a movie, this fit the description. It was like a werewolf movie, but in real life. This eyewitness reports seeing several large bipedal canine figures hiding in the stalks of corn, crouching down near the creek bed before being flushed out by a shotgun-wielding farmer. The story goes like this. I was driving home from my job at 11 p.m. I got off work at 10, so this was about an hour-long drive. I'm driving down a gravel road to my house. Something runs across the road in front of me. It seemed to be kind of hunched or crouched over, moving very fast across the road. The only way I could describe it is a monster. That's all I can really say for certain. It happened so quickly and there wasn't near enough light outside. The moon had not yet risen, and it was on a curve. I stopped, looked back towards where it went to the cornfield across the street, but did not see anything. As I continued up to my house, I passed by a neighbor who was outside and asked if everything was okay. He said that he had been chasing a pack of wild dogs up and down the road all day. I thought maybe this is what I saw, but it's way too fast to be a dog. I didn't think much of it. I went inside and was getting ready to take a shower, when from my own bedroom window, facing across the street, I see at least 4 figures come out of the cornfield by my neighbor's house. They were standing in a row along the edge of the woods just past his yard, looking around intensely for several seconds. Then, one took off in the woods, followed by another, then another. Then the last one came out of the field, looked around, until finally breaking into a run, following the others. They were moving on 2 legs, seemed to be very tall, well over 7 or 8 feet. It had been a warm day, but it was also cold outside that night. Probably only about 40 degrees. I don't normally lock my doors, but after seeing this, I went out of my way and locked them. I told my girlfriend what had happened. She didn't seem too concerned until I noticed her looking at one of our front windows behind me. She said, "What is he doing over there?" There was a man in my farmer's field across the street from my house, carrying a shotgun up towards where we saw those figures last at the edge of the woods near his house. He walked back down into one of his fields, carrying the gun like he was tracking something. We saw him walk down into his field, walk back up with nothing in his hands, looking around the edge of the woods again, then back into his house through the front door. I've tried to do some online research about wild dogs, but I didn't find anything. I even Googled Bigfoot sightings in this area, but there are really none. Just when I think I have an answer for what we saw, it leaves me more confused than ever. When asked if there were any other witnesses to the events described in this report, she said no one else had been home at the other time, though her neighbors mentioned seeing several wild dogs roaming in their fields throughout the day. The location is in Greene County, Illinois, in a town called White Heath. It was a bad snowstorm. I was driving to work around 5 a.m., maybe 4 miles from where I work. The area is very rural, so there's lots of trees and open fields next to the road. There are 3 or 4 other roads close by that connect at different parts where this happened, but they're all pretty much isolated. At first, I saw the eyes reflecting off my car towards the woods, right across the road. Then, I could see them coming closer up above a rise in the middle of the field. They were glowing red, maybe purple, and big enough for me to notice them all the way out there. As soon as I saw them, I knew it was not something normal. They kind of reminded me of deer eyes, except being red. But no deer has eyes or should have lighted up like this, not without having light shone in them. I slowed down from about 45 to around 25, and now they were running right along with me. I thought a deer had gotten caught in the headlights, but it was seeing the eyes way out there in my car wasn't really slowing down all that much. As soon as they came closer to me, I saw this was a big dark figure on 2 legs, trying to run beside my car for about 5 seconds before I got close enough for it to jump back towards the woods, away from the road. It appeared to have a hairy body of some large animal, and bigger than any bear or man. This was not a human at all, even though it walked like one. It jumped from where I was driving, and ran way faster than any human could through the thick snow in a field towards some older farm buildings. I considered for a second stopping to see if it had some kind of injury or anything, but decided against it once I realized what had just happened, seeing how it didn't look human and knowing the area is very isolated on 3 sides, with virtually no traffic at this time of day. I did not get a good look at its face, only the red eyes that were looking right into my car, judging by where they were pointing. When you have rare things happen to people, they want to tell somebody about it, even though most people won't believe them. So most stories you hear talk about a friend or something like that, which was me in this case since I don't know who's reading this. I decided to put this on here. It seemed like some people are more open-minded about things like this than others. Oh well. A year or so ago, I was working for a transport company, delivering food to grocery stores. I usually worked alone, but this particular day, another driver joined me in the truck. It was around 7 p.m. We were driving down an old abandoned road next to a forest. We drove past an old bridge where several people had committed suicide, unfortunately, by jumping off. So the authorities put up fences on either side of it to stop people from trying to take their own life. As we got closer to the bridge, I saw something standing near the fence. It turned out to be a well-built man with black greasy hair, only wearing ordinary clothes, or so what it appeared to be at first. No ordinary person would walk outside like that in sub-zero temperatures. It looked at us, and when it did, we saw that this was not a person, but a large, hairy, bulky man with the face of a Doberman pinscher. It quickly ran behind the fence before we could see where it went. The tree is blocking our view. I said to my partner, "Did you just see that?" He replied saying that was weird. There are no houses around here, and he didn't think anybody lived in the forest either. Maybe it was some homeless person. We didn't know. We continued on our route to deliver the food. On the way back, however, something followed us down the same road. It looked like a long-haired slender man running after us faster than any human should be able to. My driver slammed his foot onto the gas pedal until we got back to town. The last look I got out of it was the rearview mirror, and it looked like a very, very skinny, almost starving upright wolf. What baffles me is finding out that there are werewolves around me, but never thought they would stalk me down in an old abandoned street. I was on my four-wheeler, headed back to the house, past my grandfather's old farm. This was on a little four-track road, and about midway up, there's a barbed wire fence pasture on the right side, with tree coverage on the left. I was riding up this road, got about halfway when I saw something standing by one of the trees. It appeared to be a big black dog, bigger than anything I had ever seen in my life. Its head was about 2 feet or so above the trees, and it saw me when I saw it. I'm not sure if it wanted to attack or what, but when I hit the gas on my four-wheeler, this thing took off up the hill, across the fence, through the barbed wire, into that pasture, and it went very fast. Now, there were no houses for miles at first glance. There is nothing that could explain what I saw, besides, quite simply, just a really big, large black dog. That is, until you get closer to the pasture. All along where this thing ran, at least 8 to 10 feet long tracks from front legs, claws, and hind legs, claws, almost side by side down both sides of tracks. You could see where the grass was beat down, and there were pieces of wood from the barbed wire that were snapped. On some of these pieces of wood, there were deep gouge marks into them, where it had balled up its feet to get over the fence. I went back a couple of days later with some pictures and molds, but found nothing, except for a print in one of the trees, where it was standing about 3 feet wide. Also, there was bark missing all around it. This thing had scared me so bad, I did not even think to take my camera out until it took off running. I wish now that I would try to have gotten a picture of it, at least one. But of course my cell phone was dead. I'd been taking pictures with it earlier in the day on that spot, but of course missed my golden opportunity. First off, a little bit of background info on me. I'm not a guy that gets scared very easily. I looked into the whole Dogman and Bigfoot thing before and after this encounter, and while I thought it was strange, I wasn't necessarily curious. That being said, here's my experience. I was hiking/hunting with my 3 family members, west of the Chillicothe in Ross County. Google Maps shows the location is 20 miles east of the highway, near the Pines, an upscale housing development which sits directly south of us at the time of writing this, May 2013. This area is pretty secluded, but still has some nearby housing development along Highway 50. This day began like any other hunting trip does for me. Up at 5 a.m. to get ready before taking off at 5:30 with a partner. In this case, my father. We drove up to the area and started hiking just east of where we parked our truck, which was on a small access road near an old strip mine site. At about 10 a.m., we were walking down a ridge when all of a sudden, I noticed something big moving around in some brush off to my right, or the west. As soon as I realized what it was, I came to a near halt, leveled my rifle while calling out, "Bear!" Seeing the dogman running through the woods startled me so much, I nearly shot at it. My father looked in his direction, but didn't see anything initially. He was looking too low. He then saw it for a few seconds, and in a calm voice said, "Uh-oh," and immediately took off back to the truck. My adrenaline was pumping pretty crazy, driving me forward while I moved my rifle around frantically looking for it. I was going to blow this thing's brains out. It had initially appeared about 80 yards away, but was long gone by the time we turned to look again. I'm a pretty lanky guy, 6 foot tall, long legs, roughly 2 feet arm span, 220 pounds. My dad is 5'11", 210. The dogman was bigger than either of us, roughly 9 or 10 feet tall, maybe around 500 pounds, based on its mass and stride. Easily big enough that neither one of us could have put our arms around its chest. Its fur was a dark brown, kind of a smoky charcoal color, and it had a very human-like face, with no snout though, or a very short snout I should say, ears that were sharper and bigger than any dog I've ever seen, and standing about 3 feet taller on its rear legs than on all fours, since it did at one point run on all fours, where when it decided to stop and walk on the rest of the two, it was roughly around 9 to 10 feet tall. We judged and estimated by where it had walked by. The tree branch where it almost hit was about 9.5 feet off the ground. This sighting lasted for roughly 6 seconds, at absolute most. After the initial encounter, we did not see it again. This is not something that anybody could easily mistake for another animal or person. It stood up like a Bigfoot does in nearly everything, with knees straight, without bending over. No hocks in its legs like a dog or anything. It was entirely human, from shoulder down to foot. Even its movements were smooth, as it coasted and glided along the forest floor, calmly and easily transitioning between speeds when it needed to, running from tree to tree, low to the ground. Its forward speed seemed almost comparable to a bear, but as it moved higher up the trees and began to run along branches and trunks, its speed increased until it was moving almost as quickly as you would expect a deer to move. I've been hunting since I was 9. I'm 47 now. I looked up every cougar call and sound I could find. Nothing comes even remotely close to what I heard. I'm not scared of anything in the woods, but I know we're not supposed to have blackish-gray 6-foot-tall wolves here in this county in Wisconsin. I'm pretty confused about the whole thing, and for the first time in my life, I'm actually scared. A bizarre story came over our news desk this week involving a couple of men walking down Monroe Street in northern Greenbrush. When they say something dashed out onto the road in front of them, it would have been easier if they had seen what it was clearly, but all three described it as basically as fast as a moving large dog. So fast-moving that 2 of the men said it was nothing they'd ever seen before. I now live in Arizona. My husband and I were going camping a week ago around midnight. We were heading out to our spot when my husband says, "Look at that big dog." It looked like a coyote, but was very, very large. I pulled my gun on him, but he ran off into the bushes. I feel bad for now for not shooting him. I also saw something very weird back in 1987. It was Sunday, November 10th. I remember. I went out with some friends to watch football games outside one of their houses near Brownsville, Texas. There is nothing behind this house except woods, so nobody else is out there. It was about 2 p.m. Sunny skies out. Everywhere, no wind at all. We were sitting outside talking for a couple of hours. I decided to go inside. It had gotten cold out, since the sun was blocked by the house. I went back outside like 30 minutes later. The sky had now become cloudy and gray, full of overcast, even though there wasn't any clouds out before. It had begun going really dark, like it had gone sunset or something. But that doesn't happen this early around here, unless there's a storm coming. I look up in the sky westward, where I used to see planes flying over before Little League baseball games on Saturdays, and I saw something odd. It was a shape, but it looked bigger than any other plane I've seen. It had to at least be twice as big as the biggest plane that fly over the house. But then I realized it wasn't moving like a normal plane does. You usually don't really see planes because they're too high up in the sky, and you can't hear them when there's no wind. But this was pretty loud, and it sounded like a loud screeching noise. Well, we were all staring at this thing, wondering what it was when it flew off, ever so closer overhead, and we could tell what it was better. We realized this thing was probably a UFO. We had never seen one like this before, but it was bizarre. And after that, all these strange sightings of strange upright canines started happening all around where we lived. Of course, this was back in 1987, and shortly after all of that commotion, it kind of died down. Even in my ripe age of 47, I still remember a lot of this happening. My grandfather passed away when I was in middle school. My grandmother lived on her own until she died when I was in college. She had a few acres back behind her house. This ended at a creek where there were some woods, but the property became pretty desolate toward the end of her life. She could no longer walk well. One day when I was in high school, she was still alive. I remember this because it happened in the summer before my junior year of high school. Me and a friend whose family also lived nearby went to go visit her. We knocked on the door, nobody answered, so we walked around back to see if maybe she had fallen or something. Once we got close to the front of her garage, I saw through the window and stopped dead in the tracks, like something had caught our attention. I looked across the creek into the woods where this thing was staring, and I didn't see anything at first. And I noticed a big black figure moving quickly on two legs from the creek towards her house. It wasn't all that far away, so it did not take us long to notice something was definitely weird about this person or whatever it was. They just seemed really big. We were young teenagers. We were pretty scared. Partly of what it might be, and partly because if our parents found out we'd be wandering around Grandma's property late at night without permission, there would have been major repercussions. We ran back through the field behind her property into my friend's yard, told his mom what we saw. Now, my dad is a retired biology teacher, and he's always been really into animals. So growing up, I learned a lot just from him. Every once in a while, we would talk about Bigfoot-type creatures, because he knew that I was into cryptids, and ultimately, cryptozoology. We had never heard of the skunk ape before, and it was not something he had ever mentioned to me. But one day, we were driving down this dirt road near our house, and we both saw what looked like a Bigfoot run across the road, out of our sight behind some trees. Although it had a snout, so I'm not sure if Bigfoots have that. It seemed way too large to be a person, or even a bear, hence the snout, which is why initially we thought it was a bear. The thing that made us fairly certain it wasn't either of those things is that it kind of ran on all fours, which again is very odd for those two things to do. So my dad asked me what I thought it was. I told him I never heard of a skunk ape before, but now that he mentioned it, that's definitely kind of what it looked like. It did look somewhat apish, like if you took a man, put him in a ghillie suit, covered him in thick hair, and then kind of maybe, I don't know, gave him a werewolf mask. That's kind of the idea, except now make it run on all fours and make it as large as a bear, and only see it for roughly 5 seconds. Now you kind of have a good idea of what we saw. I do remember it left behind a very bad lingering odor, one that was incredibly musty and had a really bad kind of wet dog stink to it. Anyway, we decided to ask a few other people in our area if they knew or had any stories or knew anything about skunk apes. Almost everybody we talked to had said they had seen something similar at some point in their life, within the middle of nowhere. It turns out that there are a ton of sightings near our house, and all up the Gulf Coast, from Mississippi through Florida. This is another story from when I was little. I'm from northern Alabama originally. One summer evening, while playing on the swing set in our backyard, my brother and I noticed a large man walking around in the woods behind our house. We didn't think much about it because we assumed he was probably just hunting or something, and we could not really see him that well. Later that evening, while I was getting ready to go to bed, I looked out my bedroom window. It faced the woods, and saw what looked like some sort of big, dark, hairy creature standing by a large oak tree, looking right through me at my window. My little 6-7-year-old mind was freaking out pretty bad, so I ran into my parents' room, told them what I'd seen. One of them got up to go check on it. I don't remember which one. They never saw anything though, of course, when they went looking for it. They assumed it was my imagination. All of our neighbors have told us that when they were kids, their parents would always warn them about large creatures in the woods and tell them to stay away after dark. Of course, those could just be wives' tales. We still don't really know what they are or where they come from. I'm positive that these kinds of things exist. There's no way you could see something that much, at close range, without knowing for sure it is not a person of some kind of weird costume. Another story. I saw this weird creature while deer hunting late one afternoon in late fall. This was November, near King, Arkansas. It was about 3 o'clock. The sun had gone down behind the tree line, making visibility poor at best. I was hunting with my father, and we had been out deer hunting as long as we could in the stand. We never saw a deer, but we were always having fun. We were hiking back to the four-wheeler when we heard crackling in the leaves, roughly 40 yards away. My first thought, deer. Then I realized there was no way it could have been a deer. They don't make noise when they walk through leaves on the ground. We both froze, slowly started sneaking up towards where the sound was coming from, expecting to find a large buck standing broadside, getting ready to snag our trophy. As soon as I started moving, whatever it was must have known that we were there. It turned and started walking on 2 legs down the creek. I couldn't tell you exactly what it was, but whatever it was must have been over 7 feet. That's how tall the trees were around us. I didn't see a face or hear any sounds until my dad pulled the trigger. It turned out to be a large, upright kind of dog. We have no way to account for what we saw that day, and even now, my dad is still a biology major. That whole thing still freaks him out. Between what we saw that day of it running across the road, the smell, the large upright canine that we saw, none of it makes sense to him. But he just believes what he knows, what science teaches him. While he has a hard time acknowledging what we saw, I don't think he ever will. On a summer day in 2017, a hiker was hiking the trails in Stinchcomb Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma City. It was right around dusk, and he saw a large dark creature that ran across the trail into the brush about 10 feet from him. The creature stood up on 2 legs as it jumped thoroughly into the brush, appearing to have been well over 6 feet tall. The hiker decided against investigating after seeing this strange, frightening creature. The following day, a man who had lived near the wildlife refuge heard a strange howling that didn't quite sound like a wolf, coming from his backyard. He described it as being too unnaturally deep and loud for it to be a proper animal of its size. He said it lasted for about 5 minutes before stopping abruptly. I've lived here my whole life, 26 years, and I'm telling you, there's something out there. Whatever it is, it's lingering and waiting. I was camping one night, about 15 miles east of the bluffs in southern Missouri, with my cousin and my dog. It was just past midnight, and I heard a large rustling coming from our left side, aka north. When I turned to look at what the noise was, it sounded like footsteps, biped footsteps, much larger and heavier than any man or animal either of us have ever heard. We sat up on our elbows, trying to see what was making this god-awful sound. We are both country boys. We know how sounds travel through the hills and brush around here. The thing made quite a bit of noise as it came out into this very small area, in front of us in the clearing. All 3 of our heads turned in unison to look at it. My cousin is 6 foot, I am 5'10". This thing was easily 9 to 10 feet tall, if not larger. I mean, we're talking mammoth size. It looked kind of like a dark gray gorilla, but had a horrible wolf face. very long arms, huge claws on its hand, and almost what I would describe as spines sticking out its back. It kind of reminded me of a dinosaur or something, although with the head being more wolf-like. It had deep-set and black eyes, and the creature's skull seemed to be very sharp, as if parts of the face, the flesh was wrapped tightly around the skull, so the features were sharper, with a massive brow ridge. I couldn't see really much ears, although it did have these very slender perky things on top of its head, which I assumed were the ears. And then it howled. Thankfully, it did not seem to notice us, but when it let out this howl, it was like a nightmare come to life. It didn't sound like a wolf. It sounded like a combination of all different kinds of animals screaming at the same time, which is kind of why we thought werewolf, despite its horrible nightmarish appearance. The scariest part, though, was easily the head and face, and just how frightening this thing looked overall. There's nothing normal about it. Nothing in nature should look like this thing did. I know I will certainly never forget it. We were trying to do some serious camping out of the Pine Barrens. Yes, the same place the mysterious Jersey Devil is said to reside. While I don't believe we heard the Jersey Devil, we definitely heard something that made our blood run cold. We had been in our camp spot for about 2 or 3 days by this point. Things were going very well. We had a high-end camp stove going, bug spray, food galore. Enough beer to last us for days. It was late night, maybe 2 in the morning, and we heard the sound coming from the other side in the forest. It sounded like this deep, guttural, earthly wolf sound. It was a howling noise, but it lasted for over 20 seconds and was very deep. I have never heard anything quite like that before. I would say that there are no animals around that can make these types of sounds with their vocal cords. The closest thing of what I could think of is like imagine a wolf and then distort it by playing it through a tape recorder. Now make it sound much more demonic with a lot more noise and power. Keep in mind, I've been camping out here for years, never seeing anything or hearing anything about the Jersey Devil physically, and then I hear this. Very unusual and pretty scary. Needless to say, we did not go back there and camp after that incident. This happened in April of 2015, when I was about to turn 16. I was spending the night at my friend John's house, and we were just hanging out downstairs, playing Guitar Hero and such. It was around 11:30 p.m. when we decided to go up to his room. We turned off all the lights downstairs, closed the door. We did not want to be disturbed by the rest of the night by his little sister, who usually wakes up around 3 or 4 in the morning. His room is on the 2nd floor, overlooking the backyard. Now, his backyard is surrounded by forest and has been vacant for well over 20 to 30 years, after a small housing development was built with plans to expand in the future, but has been sitting there, vacant. As you can tell by the name of the street, this never happened. The forest is overgrown and overtaken this small development. Small birch and oak trees, weeds, vines, ferns, berry bramble, and other forest plants. It's very hard to walk through the ground, so it's barely been explored by anybody except us kids, who occasionally go out there and play, in spite of warnings that it's dangerous, due to the fact that apparently people have gone missing around here. John's house is also walking distance from mine, so I'm usually over at his place every day after school. We go to my house and do things like play video games and hang out with our friends. Around 1 in the morning, we are lying on his bed, and I heard a noise outside of his window. It makes a creak every time opened. We both sat up, looked at the window from where we were laying down. It was nearly completely pitch black outside, except for a few faint streetlights and a barely lit backyard foliage. The noise had startled me. It sounded very familiar, like somebody walking on dry leaves or sticks after it had rained and they were crushed. It was also very close to the window. It sounded like whoever or whatever was outside might have been right below his window. We both sat there silently, hoping that would not hear another sound, so maybe we could relax a little bit. I remember the wind blowing really hard. John's house shakes when it's windy outside. It's old. We kept silent for a few moments, hoping to hear nothing more than the sound of the wind. Then, we heard what sounded like noise from outside. It was so loud, it sounded like growling, like some large animals out there, hungry, wanting to eat us. We both ran to the other side of John's room as fast as we could, still very close to the window, so whatever it was would not see us. I remember standing against the wall in a corner with John, staring at his bedroom door, quietly waiting for whatever it was outside of his window to get inside. I don't know how long we were standing there, but it felt like hours until the noise finally ceased. I was very relieved that whatever had been making that noise outside John's window happened to stop, but also terrified at what we thought might have caused it, as if the feeling of not knowing was out there wasn't scary enough. The fact that it had been making all this terrible noise like growling made me think it might be something evil and dangerous. John starts walking toward his window while I'm standing there in the corner, trying not to seem scared, so he wouldn't know about my terror of whatever had been outside. He walks over, slowly opens his window so he could look outside to see if there was anything unusual in his backyard. I noticed at this point the wind had stopped blowing. The trees were not moving at all. It was strangely very still. John looks out his window for what seemed like an eternity, slowly closes it, without saying a word, turning around to say anything to me. It was then that I knew there was something evil out there that had found us. John slowly walked towards me, pale as a sheet. I asked him if everything was all right in a whisper, and he very nervously whispered no, staring at me with the look of terror on his face that I'd never seen him wear before. And we both stood there before he motioned for me to come see, not moving or really saying much of anything. The expression of fear is really hard to describe. We eventually started walking towards his window again. I followed him, and he pointed to me, with not answering, slowly trying to be as quiet as he can while opening the window, and try not to make any noise, just waiting for something to happen. I remember the moments that followed it, as if it were something out of a horror movie. We heard what sounded like branches breaking in the backyard, and he pointed to the large black shadow hidden under the canopy of trees in the far back corner of the yard that you could just barely make out if it weren't for all the faint moonlight. My stomach dropped when I saw it, and I'm getting goosebumps just writing it, forcing myself to remember this nightmare. This, dare I say, werewolf-looking thing standing there in the dark, staying perfectly still like a statue. I saw it, immediately ducking down, freaking out. "What is that thing?" I asked him. And this creature was standing next to a large bramble bush, which had now started moving towards the house. John freaked, slamming the window shut, jumped down with me, wondering what we should do. We run into the kitchen, grab knives, and run back into the bedroom, not sure what to do. We can now hear this thing start to move toward the house. And in that moment, to our horror, luckily, all the doors were locked, but we started hearing this thing violently rattling all the door handles down on the first floor. How terrifying. This went on for probably about 20 minutes or so, before it just suddenly stopped. We didn't dare look out the window to see if it was still down there. God forbid it would catch us looking and stare back at us. We stayed there, pale as sheets, terrified out of our minds, knives in hand, waiting for the end of the world. All the night sounds had stopped. Before there were crickets. Now it was nothing. We stayed like this till probably about 4:30 in the morning, when his mother got up for work. Of course, this morning she was being extra noisy, and we could hear her marching up the stairs, busting open the door, asking us why we had the knives and why we're still awake. John tried to explain to her that he could have sworn there was an intruder, which she seemed to half buy it and half not buy it. But everything was perfectly normal after that. She left for work at 5:30 like she usually does, no problems. Never saw anything, never heard anything. We finally tried to get some sleep at about 6 or 7 once the sun came up. But man, that was easily probably the freakiest encounter we've ever had. I don't know what it is that we saw that night. I don't think werewolves are real, but this was obviously some sort of creature out of a nightmare. I don't know. I don't want to know where it came from. But all I know is I don't want to see it again. I hope I don't see it again. My story takes place back in 2011, in a place that I no longer live. I've since moved out and have moved states even, But not because of this thing, but due to financial issues, which I won't get into for this. Besides that, it was a beautiful place to live and stay. That might be just why this thing was living on the backside of my property, and had been for a very long time. You see, when I had just purchased an old house on a few acres of land for what you'd say was a complete steal, the house itself really needed some work done to kind of keep it from falling apart. It was more on the dilapidated side, but I knew a little bit of sweat equity and elbow grease would bring it back up to life. The acreage behind it was practically dead with what they did to it before I purchased it, and it took me a while to get some change, working my butt off to make this place, well, livable again. Not that it wasn't livable before, but it really needed some work. I got rid of all the broken appliances, fixed up things, and gave it a much needed paint job. Replenished the washer, the dryer, the refrigerator, stove, you name it. All gone, all replaced. The previous owner kept saying, "You're gonna love it, you're gonna love it." But it didn't sit well with me at first. I could tell he was lying. I think his main selling point was the shortcut from my house to the barn and the shed. He also kept talking about how he always kept his dogs in there, and that they were great guard dogs, but they always acted funny in the barn. But nothing ever came from that conversation. Well, the fall came, then the winter came. I got tired of going out through the snow and ice, so I bought myself a four-wheeler to try and cut down on the time, making it fast enough for me to get back and forth from work. My job was an hour away from home, but with this new purchase, it almost cut down half the time, if not more. Well, that wasn't all he mentioned when he said, "You're gonna love the woods out here." Of course, my story isn't about this property, but more so the thing living on it. Let me get to that in a moment. My place sat across from a creek where deer came by roughly every night once the sun set. Obviously, deer are nocturnal, and I could have gotten a great shot at them, but these weren't your normal deer. Most of them were white, the same color as my four-wheeler was. I thought it was a product of a weird albino gene, which I never even heard of albino deer before. I never even seen them until this area, but there would be some times when I would come home late from work, and there would be dead carcasses all along the road, and just trees torn apart, like a massacre happened. The sight alone was pretty grisly, but I just figured it was nature doing what it's supposed to be doing. I want to stress that these deer weren't just ripped apart and eaten. I mean, it was a blood show. It looked like these deer had been exploded and partially eaten on. Of course, I didn't take too much time to sit there and observe the crime scene. I just kept on going. And one morning, while driving into town for supplies before work, this thing, which is what I believe to be responsible for the thing in my shed and barn and what was out in the woods, it stepped out in front of me. And I could tell you it was not a man in a costume. This thing, whatever it was on two legs, having long, shaggy fur that kind of hung down, draped down off its body. But what appeared to me to be the most frightening of all were its eyes. As it stepped into my headlight beams, I could see there was just so many things that weren't right about whatever this was. Something dragged this poor being down here with me, and I instantly thought of Frankenstein's monster. It didn't move, though. It kind of just looked like it was standing there and looked very sickly, even starving. It appeared to have ribs showing through its skin. He looked towards me on the four-wheeler, growled once before I nearly hit him, but he quickly dodged out of the way into the night. I still have no idea what it could have been. I've never seen an animal like that in my life. I can't even give you a real accurate description either, because it all happened so quickly, and it was dark. But it looked like some freak in a Halloween costume. Although, due to the size, I know that this was not the case. Now, I don't know if this has anything to do at all with the creature on my backside of my property, but I'm going to tell you about that now. So, fast forward. I was out in my barn one day, and I kept getting wafts of this wet, putrid dog smell, and I just could not discern where it was coming from. So, I just kept working on patching this large hole up in the side. It had just happened from wood rot and just time and dilapidation. This was in the spring, by the way, months after my first sighting of whatever that thing was. I want to say it was probably early spring, maybe early April, if I remember correctly. The snow had melted and it was very rainy, and the temperatures were now becoming mild. I was now done for the day, and it had now gotten dark outside. There was not enough light left in the sky to finish putting up the fencing, so I figured I would just come back tomorrow instead of trying to work by only the yard lights that I had set up. So I come outside of my barn, and I see something very large moving around right at the edge of the barn. It only lasted for about 2 or so seconds, and then disappearing towards where the creek is. And I remember thinking to myself, what was that? It really startled me because how big it was. The size alone really freaked me out. I can tell you now that this was not a bear in any way, shape, or form. It was far too large. Bears do not stand upright and walk around casually and comfortably the same way a person does. But whatever it was disappeared into the darkness back towards the creek. And that was enough for me. It was probably days before I'd even go back out to the barn to work on it again. Like I said, I was pretty spooked by the whole thing. And even then, when I'd go back to finish the patching the hole on the barn, I would keep smelling this awful stench of wet dog and rotting meat. It never really seemed to be a trace of the smell though, just this lingering odor, and I could never quite put a finger on where it was coming from. It was like it was omnipresent, everywhere, up, down, side to side, in the barn and out, and I couldn't trace the direction. Was it blowing in from the wind? I'm not sure. This happened off and on, and I never had another sighting. But as spring bled into summer, the odor got worse and worse and much more frequent, making its way over to my house. Often, it would waft out to the side of my porch, where I'd sit on every morning and have a cup of coffee. This is when I truly really began to feel uncomfortable. I knew there was something. There was a reason for this odor. And I did not want to believe it at the time, but all things pointed back to this creature, this animal, whatever it was. And then, one night, when I was coming back home from work, something was making a lot of racket and noise in the barn. So, I grabbed my gun, walked up to the barn thinking I was just hearing things. Well, it was probably hoping that I was hearing things. And I opened the doors, and I stopped. The noise inside suddenly stopped. I peeked inside, scanning with the flashlight, and at first glance, nothing. But then the flashlight and me stopped, dead ahead, because as soon as I turned, something began growling very deeply from inside the barn. And as soon as I lifted my flashlight up at it, my flashlight illuminated 2 very large amber-colored eyes. Whatever it was up on the second story, where this animal was so large, having been crouched down, like it was waiting on the upper story. I can tell you now from memory, the growl was like that of a lion, or so it reminded me of. Very, very deep and a lot of bass. Very guttural sounding. I nearly dropped my flashlight, running back to the house, grabbing my rifle, unsure of what exactly I was up against. Just from memory, the head was reminiscent of a lion. A very large wolf head with a lot of hair around it, the same way a lion's mane looks. It looked very similar, at least. And after this night, you bet, I did not go back out to that barn. And I basically just gave up on that project altogether, figuring maybe I'd just hire somebody out to come and repair it. Whatever this thing was, I'm sure it was going up from the creek to the barn, and I believe it was bedding down in there. As I said previously, there's a lot of deer in this area, so naturally, that would make for a lot of food. Well, fortunately, I can say it never came up to the house, which is a good thing, at least to my knowledge. The next time I saw it, though, was when I went to get my truck out of the barn. This is when I took one of my more powerful flashlights and was a little more confident, knowing that this thing might be in there. So I had my revolver at my hip, and I was ready. I opened the doors, got in there, and immediately I heard it again. So I jumped back in my truck, and with the barn doors open, I drove out of there as fast as the truck would allow me. For the record, this was my secondary truck that I needed for work, and I always kept this truck in the barn. Ever since winter, before I had my first sighting of whatever creature it was, I kept it in there, keeping it away from snow and weather. And now that it was roughly June, I really needed it again for work. So this thing was up there at nighttime, bedding down. Whatever this being was, it was not going to go away anytime soon. It had been more than likely living on this property for a very long time. In fact, I was probably the one encroaching on its home. So, after all of this is when I just stopped going out to my barn, period. I gave up on that last part of the property. Even come fall, when I would keep supplies in there to build a tree stand out in the back portion. And this fall, I did not even bother building one. Again, I just gave up on it. I figured, whatever creature this is, it could just take this side of the land. There's no way I'm going to try and compete with this thing. Not that I had an idea what it was. I believed that I was dealing with some large unknown canine predator, probably an exceptionally large alpha wolf. After this, I really just left it alone, not wanting to deal with any of it. So I completely abandoned my hope of working on that side of the property, not going back there anymore and just leaving it as is, partially finished. And I would leave it this way for the several next years, until I moved. I actually sold it to a really nice older gentleman who had planned on farming. I was courteous enough to inform him that there is a dog problem, something large living up in the top side of the barn. I never really got a good look at it, I told him, but I believe it's vicious. He just told me that it wasn't going to be a problem, and he had his own way of dealing with nuisances like this. Well, get this. Probably about 3 weeks after he had moved in, I stopped by his house to drop off some paperwork. The old man was on the field tilling some soil. I saw that he had multiple large bear traps all around the barn and shed. I remember he caught me looking over there, just kind of smirked and smiled and told me, "I told you, I have a way of dealing with nuisances. Don't let them bother me one bit." And that really was pretty much the end of that. But before I end this story, I've heard of other sightings in this area in the past. In fact, I've read quite a few books that have been written for this general area describing either these same creatures or something similar to what others have described. One book, I remember, was about something called the devil dog, or a hellhound. Many have described it as a dog with hooves or feet the same way a human does. One account that I read was a man who had encountered one of these things during the early springtime, this thing coming out of the blackberry bramble, attacking him and taking his young boy. The man described it as having a dog-like face but a large body of a bison, but it was upright, completely black in color. He said that while he was picking berries with his boy, this thing was stalking them and following them, like it was trying to play cat and mouse. That encounter and sighting happened roughly about 10 miles away south of the location of that home. But it doesn't end there. There are many other encounters very similar to this one, with descriptions nearly matching what I saw all throughout these remote areas of northwestern Wisconsin. I'll tell you this though, I'm pretty sure that your tax dollars paid for a cover-up of this story years back when it happened. Probably even before then too. And believe me, if you were one of these animals' neighbors, just saying, I wouldn't get in their way if one was after me either. They strike me as very intelligent enough not to interfere with humans, at least until the timing is right, until I can get a full view of the whole scope of the situation. These things are very dangerous and unpredictable, like wolves can be when you get in between them and their pups or young ones. If you're near the area of this encounter, be careful where you're out walking. These are wild animals after all. And I believe that had I tried to interfere more with this animal, creature, whatever you want to call it, it would have probably tried to take my life. I knew that I was no match, and I was not going to be worthy being up against something so large and so vicious. So just be careful, is all I'm saying. And if you ever come to Wisconsin, specifically northwestern Wisconsin, be very careful where you are. Don't always buy the first property you see. Check things out. And always, always, always stay out of the woods. My name is Mason, and I work in a small town in northern Alabama. I have worked here for about 7 or 8 years now. I am familiar with the sounds that are usual to this area at nighttime. I've heard coyotes, owls, and even the occasional wolf in this area, even mountain lions. See, I used to work at a large military appliance factory that has been in town for a long time. We assembled large things like ovens and refrigerators, primarily used for military bases. So, every night, hearing clangs and slams from people working on heavy machinery was nothing new. But at night, though, when everything would go very quiet, you would hear things that you could just not explain, especially since your ears would be ringing from all the noise inside the factory. Now, this strange noise, I believe, carried on to my latest job that I've been working at now for several years. I've heard this sound a total of 4 times now, or 4 separate incidents. Every time, it's been behind our building, where we load trucks and trailers onto every single night. It's a pretty empty lot. It is not fenced off. There is nothing back there except woods and a river bottom. I know that spot is common ground for homeless people and drug addicts to congregate. There's always a lot of trash and old heroin needles back there. I've been there before, and it's not a pretty sight. The first time I heard this noise, I thought it might be some kind of wolf, maybe. However, after listening closer, I realized it did not sound like any animal you would normally hear. It was more human-like sounding, and it would only last about 3 seconds the first time. It was also accompanied by very heavy breathing, like somebody had just finished sprinting or something, but they sounded very large. I did not think much of it. Maybe just some homeless person back there, I don't know, even though nobody is allowed to be. But after hearing it 3 times this separate night, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., and 5:30, again and again, I decided I should probably look into what sort of animal this could be. Sometimes, if you listen closely, it seems like it lasts for up to 10 seconds. Okay, so maybe this has gone on more than just 4 times. But the second time was when my friend and me heard it together. We were both outside, loading up one of the trucks. We stopped and we both just stood there, not saying anything. And then my friend goes, "What the heck was that?" We had stopped because we had heard this very long, very drawn-out, over-exaggerated howl. I'm not lying when I said it sounded like a human, but it also sounded like a wolf, except just much larger and deeper, like if somebody took the scream of a human and the howl of a wolf and meshed it together. The third time, I was by myself, and I heard the sound coming from behind on my way to my car. After hearing it, I was incredibly scared, quickly running to my car. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as I could. But this was not the last time and the only time, of course, I would hear it. Now, in my opinion, this other time was probably the most frightening. I had stepped outside on my break, was checking my phone, and I heard something really big crashing around in the woods, maybe 50 feet away from the back side of the parking lot. I also heard a scream, and it sounded like a flipping dinosaur. I nearly crapped myself and ran inside. The next day, we found a bunch of weird, long black fur all over the back of one of our trailers. It was very strange. Nobody knew what it came from. One friend of mine who works at the factory said that actually he hunts a lot of black bears, and this fur is definitely not black bear fur. But there's no other animals that this fur could have came from. It was very unsettling, to say the least. And of course, the other time was on May 25th, just a few nights ago. It sounded like something had jumped onto the roof of one of the big trailers and began stomping around before running off. There was dents all over the top of the roof. I wasn't really too spooked by this, but I am friends with somebody who works at a steelyard mill very close by. He said the workers over there have heard something big and heavy as well, jumping around. They've never wanted to stick around though long enough to investigate. I would love for somebody out there to tell me what on earth is making those sounds behind us. Any comment will really help. Thanks. I can tell you the year, month, but not the exact day. I remember it was October of 2015. I know that. Just 2 years ago now. I had been driving back from a friend's house and was about a half an hour away or so from my boyfriend's house, which is where I was currently headed. It was dark out and it was also raining. I had to take a dirt road to get out to his house. I-75 unfortunately doesn't go anywhere near his house. Now, the dirt road goes through a bit of state forest, but it's not really that long of a drive. I'm pretty sure there was only one other car that went down the same road with me that night. It was roughly about 4 miles before my turn on this road. The first thing I saw when I got closer were the headlights shining off something on the ditch on the right-hand side of the road. up ahead of me. So it was so big that it caught my attention. As I got a little closer, I saw that it appeared to be a huge dog or something in the ditch, eating what looked to be like a dead deer. At first, I assumed maybe somebody had just dumped roadkill and that this thing was eating on it. But it was eating like it hadn't eaten in days, and wasn't even fazed by my car oncoming. It didn't even seem to notice or care about me being there at all. I never heard of Dogman before, and so I was just kind of taken aback by the sighting. There were a few problems though generally right away. Some of the first few things I noticed was just how large this large dog or wolf was, and the fact that it appeared to be crouched down like a man was, eating on this carcass using its hands the way a human would, intelligently. Its hands also kind of reminded me that of a raccoon's. I rolled down my window and turned my radio down very low and drove by very slowly. I could hear what it was doing, crunching and tearing on the flesh, but there wasn't really any other sound. It didn't even seem to mind that I passed by slowly, but something about this thing just did not sit right with me at all. Maybe due to the fact that this thing looked just like a werewolf, just sitting there in the ditch casually, ripping apart this carcass and eating. I could literally feel the blood draining from my face as I drove by this thing, just taking in what I saw before me. It all only lasted but a few seconds, but that was more than enough for me to take in. So I quickly rolled up my window before this thing decided to take notice of me and sped up a little faster than the speed limit. On the way, this feeling of dread just washed over me as I'm trying to justify in my own mind what I saw, and that what I saw was actually real. I was seriously beginning to doubt my own sanity, and very rightfully so, to anybody who would see something like this. The way its hands looked, they were so human, and the long hair all over its body, and at the fact that it was so large. There is no denying that what I saw for those few seconds was real. And let me tell you, even though this happened 2 years ago now, every night when I go to bed, I still can see its face clear as day in my mind, just before falling asleep. It haunts me so much that this thing is out there. I'm still just trying to wrap my mind around what it could possibly be. Even now, I know my boyfriend has told me things, but I just have a hard time accepting it. I did want to add in this last little bit to my sighting. So I didn't tell my boyfriend right away, and I eventually did tell him about what I'd seen. At first, I'm not going to lie, I thought I was going crazy. But my boyfriend actually told me about Dogman and that they're real creatures. That all made sense for a little while. It sat with me better than the idea of a real living werewolf, of course. I work in a law firm in town, so I really prefer not to share my name due to not wanting to ruin my career. I hope this sees you well. This is my sighting, which terrified me. My father and I were hunting in southwestern Wisconsin, just north of the Illinois border, in a stand we built around 10. We both had our 12-gauge pumps, and my 30-06 with me. My father was carrying his 410 single shot. The wind was blowing like crazy. We expected deer to pass us by, but it didn't happen or so for about an hour after sunup. During that time, I spotted 5 turkeys, 2 rabbits, and what appeared to be lots of movement and tree activity from branches rustling when the wind had passed. There seemed to be something more here. As it was getting later into the hunt, I began to get the deer fever feeling and needed to pee very bad. Now, this wasn't just any stand. At least 50 yards away was a wall of thick brush with briars growing in it. There were dead tree limbs everywhere, so you could easily trip over one if not paying attention. I told my dad I would be right back. I had to go pee. He nodded okay. As soon as he turned his head, after hearing something crunch off to my left, him being slightly deaf didn't hear it. Then, about 4 seconds later, something large crashing through the same area, making the same noise, only this time much smaller crashing sounds, snapping under the weight of whatever this was. I realized very quickly what I had heard, but didn't fully process it for a couple of seconds. I started to grab my gun, and I saw movement through the brush and saplings roughly 20 yards away. What I saw was huge, and looked like a large hairy gorilla, standing up with its arms down to its side. The head, though, looked more canine, kind of like a German shepherd's head. Now, out here, we have black bear, coyotes, and even Canadian geese, so there was no doubt other things were here, but this wasn't any one of those. I'm fairly tall, 6'9", and very skinny, and this thing was definitely taller than I. As soon as I saw this thing, it made me think of Bigfoot, because of its height from the ground to shoulder being much larger than any man could appear at this distance. This was not somebody or another hunter. This was not somebody in a costume. The size and proportions were just wrong. The thing turned away from me, and I could see the long hair on its back, swaying in the wind, its arms also swinging in sync with its strides. It had a very wide torso, big shoulders, and a lower body, much smaller than its waist. If you can imagine how a gorilla walks on two legs, that's kind of what this looked like, but much more agile. Then it stopped to turn, look at me, and I could see its face was black like the color of its short fur. It had big yellow eyes that stood out due to how dark the surrounding face was, and a long snout, thin lips, and sharp teeth showing through. My first thought was a demon, because if you saw this face yourself, you would think this was something out of hell. It had a very dog-looking face and head. It was really ugly. And then it kind of gave me this terrifying grin before turning back around and walking off beyond the trees. I waited around for about 20 minutes, but it never showed back up. I feel like my father was close to passing out, I'm sure, due to his age. He was pretty shaken up, because he had seen it too. This was after I got back to the stand. He too had heard something very big crashing through the brush, scaring away all the deer. I can only imagine. I should have never went off alone. Due to the sensitive nature of the information that I'm about to share with you, I'm going to remain anonymous for this email. I hope you can understand. I will say that I'm deeply involved in the military. I have deep levels of security clearance, which is why I'm not revealing anything about me. But I wanted to share with you some information I think you might find interesting. I've been watching your channel for a while now, and I noticed you have a lot of sightings and encounter stories of several things that you refer to as cryptids. Some see them as demons, while others see them as simply flesh and blood beings. A sense of being in the middle of the military, we have stories of our own that the majority of civilians will never know of, and for good reason. Some of the things that I know have happened are incredibly violent, but as you've already tapped in on many of the stories you featured on your channel, so much of it is quickly covered up. I'll tell you this, there's even a budget designated specifically to just covering up things like this. If you just want a bit of a glance into our world, you could look into several military and police encounters with Bigfoot alone. As an example, there are a multitude of ex-military who've shared some of their stories. One that immediately comes to mind is a gentleman whose name I forgot, but he talks about an ops mission where him and a team of 6 others go on and take down a small group of very aggressive Bigfoot in the south. You might know who I'm talking about, but the story is out there for those who want to listen. This stuff is real. It does actually happen. I don't claim to know everything there is to know on the subject, but I certainly know a lot. I've been close to a lot of this stuff. I wish that people would be able to share more freely about these stories, but if you're in the military and you see something like this, there's very strict protocol for what can be shared and what even can be given to the public. Now, back in 2011, my team was on a training mission deep in the Ozark Mountains. We were deep enough into the mountains that we would not be disturbed. We had a base camp set up and we were preparing for some more training when we decided to take a break, head down to the stream and just fill up our water. After filling up multiple canteens, we began to head back towards camp when one of my men stopped in his tracks, turned to me and waved me over quietly. He had something to show me. I informed the rest of the team to hold position while I checked this out with him. He pulled out his phone, which was given to us by command for being on this mission, so he could record things if needed. The video was allowed only during this time. As we looked into the trees, we saw something that's very rare for this part of the country. Large dogs. But they weren't just large dogs. These were creatures. We counted around a dozen or so. This is a low estimate, of course, because we feel there could have been more. At least several packs. I'm not going to say what they were called, but let's just say they were very large and could be described as giant black wolf-sized creatures. Now, the first thing that's going to come to mind was Bigfoot, but these things weren't acting anything like what you'd expect from either one of those. As he had recorded on his phone, I had my weapon raised and ready for whatever may come our way next. They did not act aggressive at all, but more so observant. It felt like they were closely observing every movement. We stood there for a good hour, just watching them, trying to get a closer look. But they would never come closer than 50 yards. They stayed back away and carefully watched us at our base camp. That night, as we set up a new camp, we all tried sleeping, at least the ones of us on shift too. But we could tell that these things were around. There was just this energy in the air that you can't really explain. And there were easily 8 or 9 of them very close by. You could hear them moving around, circling all around our camp, just outside of the light. They were making all sorts of racket, growling, yapping, howling, making this weird clicking sound. But they never showed themselves, or even tried to attack, although we did feel more on the defensive side. The following day, we were moving to our location via GPS coordinates, and we think they were tracking us the same way a wild predator would track its prey. It's almost as if they were waiting for just the right moment to pounce. They were likely strategizing, looking for the perfect moment to flank us. On the second night of setting up camp, one of these things must have felt brave. It tried attacking one of my team members, in which we all retaliated in firing at this thing. I just want to say that this was my first time ever dealing with something like this. Before this mission, I had heard stories and read many reports. And being in this unit that I am, this was my first actual experience dealing firsthand in person with something that most civilians would never even consider. I'll be honest and say whatever being this was closely resembled that of a werewolf. I can't say factually if werewolves are real or not, but I can say that this creature, or animal, physically resembled a fictitious creature. The body was like that of a weightlifter. You could see the muscles rippling underneath the stomach, chest, and biceps. Even the thighs were thick. The legs were hocked, the same way a dog's were. You could tell it was very lean. Its arms were long, had hands that were much more closer to that of a human being's than a dog. Very long fingers, each having about 2-inch long black claws at the end. The hands also appeared to be just like ours, 4 fingers and 1 opposable thumb. All of this leading to a massive head that seemed quite disproportionate to the rest of its body. The snout was also average length. It wasn't too long or too short in proportion to the head, but was also massive, along with the rest of its body. Long canines protruded out the very front of the snout, the same way things would protrude out the front of a saber-toothed cat, for example. Dramatic and over-exaggerated in length and size. The mouth was also filled with teeth, and a lot of them. This would be more reminiscent to a shark or a crocodile than that of a canine. The eyes were very deep and set in the skull. They seemed to almost glow this ominous yellow color. I remember its ears too, very tall and pointed, very long, having tufts of fur at the very top. I don't recall ever seeing a tail at all, and I can only assume that the one we shot was probably one of the males, or the alpha himself. This was a big guy, easily, 8 to 9 feet tall, towering over us and our equipment. It was like standing next to an upright grizzly bear. One swipe and you're gone. In fact, us shooting at it probably just drove it away. I don't think we really hurt it. I know we didn't kill it. After shooting at it and it retreating, the rest of the pack was still pretty much around, but I think they left us alone after that, because they didn't bother us the rest of the mission, until we departed 3 days after. We were also just one of 3 teams. Another team, I would come to find out, had actually killed several of these canine creatures who they described to us were identical to the same creatures we were dealing with. This team was 12 miles away, on the other side of the mountain. The only difference that they described is primarily coloration and body stature. The other creatures they saw were more gray and a little bit more lean and slender, while the ones we saw were primarily all black and much more buff. They killed about 4 of these things, while nearly losing several of their own team members. These things acted extremely aggressive and violent. They believe it was due to interrupting a hunt, or interfering with their food chain or hunting seasons. Something. However, it's all just speculation. These things also appear to know what guns were and weapons were, because from my teammate, who was very good friends with the other teammates, on the team that was 12 miles away on the other side of the mountain, they acted different once they saw the rifles. That was not the same situation with us. They didn't really seem to know or care that we had pointed our guns at it, but again, just more questions upon more questions. We don't actually know for sure. Fast forward to 2013, and we were up now in Maine as a part of a different training routine. All of a sudden, we hear this loud noise. It was kind of like a howl, but different. It wasn't like any sound I'd ever heard. I've been in the woods before. I've heard coyote howls, I've heard wolf howls, I've heard a multitude of sounds from animals. This was nothing like anything I've heard. It didn't even sound human. Like, I've heard the boys try to attempt and mimic these sounds in an attempt to scare us, but it was nothing like a human could reproduce. Then, we saw a large thing moving on through the trees. It appeared to be a large dark shape moving directly toward us. I assumed it was a bear, and told everybody to shoot it. As we prepared for the fight of our lives, I realized then what was coming at us was not anything bear or even remotely human. Once it appeared, it was much more canine in nature than anything else. The creature resembled a large black dog with dark fur and huge teeth. But of course, this wasn't no ordinary dog. This thing also, like the other creatures we had encountered, stood upright on 2 legs. The arms were a bit longer than the other creatures I had seen, reaching down almost to its knees. Its head was very similar to that of a German Shepherd's, but more resembling a Doberman Pinscher only. The head was much larger, of course, and the features much more exaggerated and pronounced. This particular creature looked similar to the ones we had fought before, but there were some stark differences, and also much more muscular around the head, unlike the others who resembled large wolves. This was more reminiscent of a Doberman, and again, much more sleeker than a bodybuilder kind of body, but just as tall, with an attitude that was all the same. The body was quickly taken by another branch of military that I'm not allowed in any way, shape, or form to speak about. We obviously killed it. That's all I can say about that. None of us got a chance to stand around and inspect it or look at it. We didn't have time to. Our superiors were very quick to make sure that we all signed paperwork to ensure that whatever it was taken care of. Look, I apologize for having to be so vague about this, but you have to understand that my life is on the line here for even speaking about such things. Before I go, I got another story to share with you. I'll share this story from a fellow military officer who's encountered similar beings while off in the jungles of South Korea and Vietnam alike. One of my good friends, whom we'll call Frankie. He's an older guy and was stationed in South Korea in the 90s. His squad dealt with a creature very similar to the ones we've been encountering here in North America. The first thing he described to us was a very odd metallic taste in his mouth and a feeling of being watched, but also like there was some sort of strange psionic communication going through the trees with these creatures. He described it as almost a frequency thing. He's not sure if it was something psychic or mind control induced, but he said it felt like they were just trying to communicate. Intelligently communicate, but nothing language-wise that he could really relate to. He claimed that over time, he did come into contact with these things, several times before they finally showed themselves in full view. One night, when his squad had just set up camp for the evening out in the jungle, they were standing near the campfire, when all of a sudden, Frank said he heard this loud, indescribable noise coming from down the sloping hill. When they looked to see what it was, they saw them for the first time in full view. a pack of these creatures, standing about 6 feet tall. He described them as being very canine in nature, long slender necks, and chins that came up to their large forehead, where their eyes were. The head itself was brachycephalic, meaning it had wider set, more pronounced dog-like muzzles, with large areas around the eyes, which made him recall images of African wild dogs, although much smaller in stature, obviously, but still very canine-ish. He recalls them looking very hyena-like too. All 7 of them standing off in the distance, facing the small camp, when they begin to charge. To make a long story short, the encounter ended in a bloodbath. 2 of his men were killed, slaughtered, torn to pieces. Frank explained that all 7 of these creatures were shot dead. He explained that he got a pretty good look at the bodies, and said it was like a science experiment between half man and half dog. Not like werewolf in either way, but more of a hybrid sort of way. He also claimed these things had a very unique stink to them. He couldn't even describe it. When he tried to, the best he could say it was this musty jungle odor, mixed with a metallic-y copper smell. And speaking of the jungles of Vietnam and South Korea, I've been told there's actually an entire stack of paper somewhere that has been whited out of the numerous reports of soldiers being killed, attacked, maimed, you name it, from these kinds of creatures, just from Vietnam alone. I think the most frightening thing is they're not all the same creature, but cryptids are beings that exist in these jungles that are not talked about. Obviously, for U.S. military personnel, speaking on this manner is a big no-no. Frank even shared me with a story when he was younger in his later 20s, and when he was in Vietnam. He saw one of his close friends, whom he made buddies with in the military, get torn in half by a large ape-like creature that existed in the jungles. He claimed that this thing looked similar to that of an ape, but had horns sticking up out of its head, and had a very short but fat snout. He doesn't think of any sort of creature he can relate it to, and said he felt nothing but fear and terror. He still feels guilt over the fact that he was able to escape, because it was too busy ripping his friend to pieces. They were clearly no match for whatever creature this was. He claimed he was too terrified to even shoot at it. He also went on to tell me about several tunnels dug underneath the ground in the Vietnam jungles, but is home to much more frightening things than the ape creature that Frank and his friend had encountered. Another friend of mine, whom I'll refer to as Dawn, spoke about a time also in the early 90s, when, unlike Frank, was in Vietnam, claims that something large came up from underneath the ground, tearing off part of his foot with its huge claws. His claim is that it resembled a large lizard-looking thing, but very human at the same time. He nearly died from blood loss. I'll share with you one last and final story, so this email hopefully doesn't end up too long. This one is back in 2014 when a team of mine and I were stationed in an area that I can't say, but I will tell you it was in southern Louisiana. We're talking in the bayous. While we were out on a scouting mission, we encountered what I can only describe to you as a very aggressive alligator humanoid. I use that term because there's simply no other way to describe this kind of being. Being in this environment, it's already quite hostile, filled with all sorts of poisonous reptiles, like water moccasins, alligators, among many other poisonous insects and animals. You have to really be alert of your surroundings and very, very careful. But had you told me these things were out there, I would have never believed you. This thing nearly took out my teammate. After standing up in the water and trying to attack our small boat, one quick bullet to the eye into the skull took quick work of it, or at least stopped it. And when I say this thing was half alligator, part humanoid, I'm not kidding. I'm not sure if there's some huge genetic experiment going on in having these things released into the wild or what, but they seemed very hell-bent on wanting to eat us. Its size alone was already hard enough to take down, but I feel like we were able to manage enough. Even though everybody on the crew was pretty shaken up, we had to shake it off and get over it pretty quickly, moving on with the mission. But you can bet, we were a lot more alert to our surroundings after that. If there's one, there's always more. I'll go ahead and try to end this for now, but I just want you to understand that there's things out there we can't quite comprehend. We're just told to keep quiet and continue on with our mission, to not ask any questions. I think a lot of people really undermine us because we're people too. We may not be civilians and we may have higher privileges and clearances, but we're human beings. We are naturally curious and have questions ourselves. Those questions are usually silenced and shut down. If you are somebody who fancies themselves out in the outdoors, all I could recommend is that you be extremely careful and very alert. Media and modern-day society will beat you over the head with these false narratives that there's nothing you need to be scared of, and that all these creatures and beings are made up and simply do not exist. I'm here to tell you that that's a very clever and well-paid cover-up. How do I know that? Because I've dealt with these things firsthand. I know these things. If caught off guard, they can prove deadly. And I know that in my missions, if I was not alert in training that I had, I would have been killed. Of course, I don't have any evidence behind what I'm about to say, but I believe personally that a lot of the missing persons in national parks, among just missing persons in the forestry, are due in part to these beings. This isn't canine exclusive either. I'm talking things about like Bigfoots and other strange cryptids we're not exactly allowed to discuss. Our job as military personnel is to go in, complete the mission, and make quick work of whatever it is we have to do to move on. Hopefully, this email can answer a bunch of your questions. I can't guarantee you that I could reply back and provide you with more information. I'm really trying to keep on the down low here. I've probably already provided you with more than enough information that I'm ever allowed to share, with hopefully not giving myself away, in case this ever really gets listened to. For now, I will wish you good luck on your channel and your YouTube endeavors. If you decide to read this to your audience, I just want them to know that they need to be careful when they're out in nature and understand there's more than meets the eye. The world in which we perceive and the things we are told about by a society are filled with lies, more than you can imagine. Take care for now, and be safe. My sighting occurred in March of 2016. I was walking to my car in the early morning, and I saw a large black canine, roughly 9 feet tall, coming from across the parking lot towards me. I was in Temple, Texas, at an apartment complex where I live. It's around 2 in the morning, and I just got off work. I walked out the front doors of my job, and there's a small wooded area that separates my apartments from the next building over. Through this little path, I could see something brownish, but not sure what it was due to it still being so dark outside. So, I continued walking, trying to make too much noise. Maybe whatever it was would get scared and leave. But for some reason, I can't help this feeling that something just isn't right. I turn around and look again, and I see this strange black creature, having almost glowing yellow eyes, not even 50 feet away. I can't make out most of the shape, except for this large, giant wolf-like head. That's what scared me the most. So I'm standing there in shock, trying to comprehend what in the world I'm looking at, and then it starts briskly moving towards me, but not completely noticing my presence. I think it was more just moving in my direction. At this point, I decide to make a beeline for my car. If this thing wanted to attack me, it would have done so already, since I was standing still for far too long. So I start running as fast as I can, when suddenly another man who worked for the complex saw us both, and also started to sprint towards his car. I'll never forget the look of fear on his face once he saw what was behind me. At this point, I was just hoping that this thing would stop chasing us, but it did not. We both got into our cars and locked the doors, and we watched it quickly disappear across the street into a large open field, where it ducked down under the grass, and we did not see it anymore. We were both pretty shaken up, especially myself, because I work over there late at night, often by myself, and I have never seen anything like this happen before. I'm telling you, this wasn't a person in a costume. It was not human. When I looked into those eyes, I saw intelligence. I saw a killer. I also felt an extreme adrenaline rush. It's not a dog. This is not a misidentification. I'm only going to have to guess that this was some species of werewolf or something, or upright dog, or maybe possibly a canine bear. I don't know. But whatever it was, I don't want to see it again. It's been in my nightmares since this happened, and it's been more than enough to terrify me and even cripple my work at my job. It was in the early morning hours when I decided to step outside for some coffee and to watch the sunrise, but I caught something off in the distance by the woodline. I could feel something was off when I saw it. I quickly stared intensely into the woods, trying to see clearly. Luckily, I had my rifle close by in case anything went awry, and for protection, of course. But suddenly, a pair of eyes I noticed were staring right back. This wasn't anything I had seen before. It seemed to be attached to a large figure that moved cunning all throughout the trees. It was hard to make out how big this was, but the silhouette indicated that it must have been nearly about 9 or 10 feet tall. Just thinking back to it makes me shiver. Then, slowly but cautiously, this thing began to gently sway side to side, and then move off to the side towards the other end of the field. Then quickly turned back and went further into the woods. That's when it disappeared, and the intense feeling I had in my stomach dissipated entirely. I sat there for the next hour, just watching the woods intently, waiting for this thing's return, not knowing exactly what I just saw, but I knew it was something that wasn't normal. I can't make any speculation about what it was because, quite frankly, I don't know. But I know the instant I sat outside of my porch before I even saw it, I just had this feeling in my stomach that something wasn't right. I had set up hunting camp in the foothills of Idaho on some land that I had permission to hunt on. The road in was about 3 miles off the main drag through the hills, and at this time of year, late August, it would be dark somewhere around 9 p.m. So, after my husband drove out with all of our stuff, he left me there on the bank of the Boise River, on top of some hills. There was a power line right by the start of the trail that led up to the campground, so you could hear some electric buzzing noise for most of my first night there. The trail had these steel posts installed about every 30 feet, with high-powered light bulbs. It really lit up the area below me at night, even though I just had a lantern with me. The posts were meant for OHVers, dirt biking during day hours, but after hours, they became something else. There was not supposed to be any ORVers on this land at all, let alone at night. There was also an old stone quarry hidden away in these foothills, where kids go and party and also do dirt biking. I knew there were two, because sometimes you could smell the burning rubber and hear them coming from a long ways away. I was just finishing dinner my first night and I heard some metal clanging behind me, like somebody was knocking over these steel posts. At least, that's what I thought at first. But as it turned out, I started to hear these growling sounds getting closer and closer until it sounded like they were right next to camp, below me. This went on for about a solid 10 minutes, and then suddenly, everything got really quiet yet again. That's when things took a turn for weirder though. You see, this section of land is known to have packs of wild dogs that live in the area. Like coyotes, but not. I had heard they were pretty mean too. But at this point, I just wanted to get out of there. I was alone. I had no phone service, and if one decided to want to take a bite out of me for dinner, there wasn't much I could do about it, except maybe throw some rocks or start screaming for help in hopes that somebody might hear me. Also, the hills sort of muffled any noise, so even if somebody did hear me, it would be pretty hard to pinpoint my exact location. If you've never driven down dirt roads before, let's just say you don't need your hands free to drive. So, as everything went quiet again, just as I picked up the lantern and started packing everything back to my backpack, as I was just about to set out on my 3-mile hike down the trail, there was another knockover on one of these steel posts. This time, it sounded as if it had fallen right by the trail. I needed to get down there, so I knew this would be my one and only chance. I left everything but what I could fit in my pack, set out on a dead sprint towards the road at full speed, pushing through thorns and brush like some sort of wild animal being stalked and hunted. I don't remember stopping until I got to where one of the steel posts had clearly fallen. The hillside angled steeply downwards at that point, so even though nobody could have seen me, if anything had wanted to hurt me, they could have easily chased me down the hillside. There was nobody around for miles, so I had no choice but to keep moving on. But what was strange is after that last knockover of the steel post, nothing else happened. No growling or knocking. I kept on running, and let me tell you, I locked every door when I finally got back in. I saw one of these strange creatures begin chasing me down through the brush, but after that last one post got knocked, everything got more quiet. Considering I was being chased and my husband still had no idea where I was. This whole thing easily felt like some horror movie right then and there. Luckily though, it didn't. So the end result was that I made it down safe and sound and back to the mainland without any harm coming to me. But of course, after something like this, you start hearing stories. At least the rest of my stay in Boise went without anything weird happening, which is why I'm telling my strange story now. I just want to reiterate that these dogs that I saw that day, they were these strange hyena-looking wild dogs. I don't think I've ever seen such a thing before. It's definitely made me second guess going in Idaho at all for hunting. I was working as a deputy sheriff in Mineral County, Nevada. I was a couple of years out of the academy, and part of my training was to go through all of our law enforcement reports, categorize them according to certain criteria, add other pertinent information, and publish it on a yearly basis in order for the residents of Mineral County to have an accurate accounting for crime within. The information is given from year to year, from 79 until present time, 2012, at the time of this writing. I began going back through these records because another agency had requested this info for a criminal justice class they were teaching. In any case, while going through these old files, I came across an incident that seemed so strange that I've not forgotten about it. The incident happened in late September or early October during 1997. I decided to pull the crime report on this incident and read it again. The date of the crime is October 3rd, 1997, at approximately 12:30 a.m. It took place on Highway 95, near mile marker 11, between Hawthorne, Nevada and Reno, right off the road in some very rugged terrain. You can find an aerial map of this area by searching for Walter Lake on Google Earth. I can give you the exact coordinates if you wish. The reporting party was a Mineral County deputy sheriff who said he had just come around the cliffs, heading north towards Hawthorne, when he saw something large crossing the highway, roughly 200 feet ahead of him, that stopped in what appeared to be a small cut in the mountain. He described as an alcove. He stopped his patrol car and turned on his emergency lights. Now, as soon as his vehicle came to a stop, this thing, whatever it was, turned around and looked at him for about 1 second, then took off straight up the side of the mountain in a blur. He told me that he had hit the gas hard, got out of there because he had never seen anything move so fast in all of his life, approximately the speed of 100 plus miles an hour, according to the witness. He said when he first saw it crossing the road ahead of him, it appeared to be black or dark brown in color, but when its eyes reflected back at him from his headlights, they were definitely a fiery yellowish orange. His estimates of the height from the ground up are about 7 feet, very broad shoulders, long arms and legs, not a bear or a human. As far as he knew, there were no bears in this area that existed, and had never seen anything like it before, even after working 21 years as a deputy sheriff. Now, I have been patrolling that same stretch of Highway 95 going north out of Hawthorne for many years. I can say with 100% certainty that at least 80% of what is described makes absolutely no sense. The biggest problem to me would be trying to figure out how an animal could traverse through such rugged mountainside terrain without making any noise or sound. There are several sheer cliff faces and drop-offs right near mile marker 11, and the mountain is very steep, covered with scrub brush and almost no large vegetation of any kind. The area around there gets quite cold at night, in the 30 degrees, even during late summer months. This statement about its eyes reflecting back at him from his headlights also makes little sense to me. The officer stated originally that it stopped on top of the small cut in the mountain, which I would estimate to be approximately 40 feet high by 20 to 30 feet across. This means that if you had your lights on bright enough for this thing to reflect back at you, then you had to have had your lights shining right into its face. It would have been harder for him not to see it than to see it. That's how brightly lit this thing would have been. I have never heard any information or evidence that would lead me to believe that there are Bigfoot-type creatures in Nevada. But this report definitely has made me scratching my head. If anybody else who patrols that area happens to read this, please contact me. I would love to hear what you think about all this and maybe share some information on these incidents which occur. The next time this officer was driving north on Highway 95 at 12:30 a.m., he saw it again. This time, about 300 feet ahead of him, crossing the road once more. Same location, right along mile marker 11. Only this time, moving towards the east, away from Hawthorne. He stated that it ran across the highway very quickly, approximately 60 miles an hour, and hit the east side of the mountain on the other side, going up approximately 50 feet before stopping on a ledge to look back at him as he passed underneath it. I know there are legends of skinwalkers, so this might be the case, or something of the supernatural realm, but I'm not so sure. Now, I had spoken with the Mineral County Sheriff Deputy who was first on the scene after this officer called in from his cell phone that he had been involved in a chase of some sort right around the same point, mile marker 11 on Highway 95, but lost whatever it was during the pursuit. This officer said that as soon as he got out of their vehicle, they heard some very heavy footfalls coming from above them, as if something or somebody was running away from them towards Hawthorne. They then saw what appeared to be an extremely large man covered in hair running by the front of their patrol vehicle and down into a gully or a ravine next to the road. He described it as moving extremely fast and even estimated the height from the ground up to be roughly 7 feet. Very broad shoulders, long arms and legs. That is when he radioed in what had just happened, proceeded up the mountain on foot, looking for whatever this thing was that had just run by him. After searching around for several minutes, they did not find anything but heard another set of very heavy, thudding footsteps running, coming from roughly 200 yards away, heading back towards them, at which they then radioed dispatch, saying whatever it was seemed to be circling them. They said they could hear its heavy breathing, even though it was probably still 400 yards away. The Mineral County Sheriff arrived on scene, approximately 15 minutes later. Then another MCSO deputy shortly after, who had been patrolling closer to Hawthorne, heard the radio traffic, coming up to assist as well. They all searched around the area for several hours, with both flashlights and spotlights shining into the holes in the rock, crevices between boulders, but did not see whatever it was again. However, they did find footprints. One set matched perfectly with those that this officer said he found earlier, right beside his cruiser. There were no casts made of them, to my knowledge. And another set, which appeared to be biped, only much more and much larger than any man could ever possibly make. They were also canine in appearance, but much larger than any known canine or wild dog. There were also other strange prints that nobody could identify and were unlike anything any of the officers had ever seen. Very long and wide with 4 toes, and a round ball type of print, similar to what you would see made by an elephant, but much more slender. The officer who saw this creature was so shaken up by this encounter that he had actually requested a transfer from Mineral County due to his wife being afraid for him after hearing what had happened to him during the night. He never pursued any type of investigation into these incidents, nor does he want anybody else to, but just wanted me to know about it since it occurred right where I lived at the time. His request for anonymity will be respected, so please do not bother him about this if you happen to know who he is or want any more information. This officer has also seen the elusive Mineral County Wildman, once while on duty patrolling in the county, living there for almost 22 years. A few months back, he took some photos of a hairless gigantic footprint that were found out in the desert near Hawthorne during a fight between 2 men called into dispatch by somebody who had gone out there with friends to shoot rabbits. This guy said they were extremely surprised when these same prints appeared in front of them after walking through the area earlier without ever having seen anything but scattered rabbit tracks. They immediately stopped shooting, called it into dispatch so they can get some officers out there to look at it before something very bad happened. They were so spooked out by it, they didn't stick around for very long. Another incident he had come across was back in the early 1980s while working patrol for another agency, before coming to work for Mineral County. He said that one night, he and his partner, both young officers then, were dispatched to a location where somebody had seen an extremely large man walking along one of the canyon roads near Hawthorne. This was during daylight hours. When they arrived, 2 officers already saw that there was this guy, but lost sight of him after driving further down the road. They could still hear something off walking along next to them though, breaking on the brush. They searched up and down the road for at least an hour, trying to find whoever or whatever it was, but could never. This particular officer was also convinced that both these creatures are very real, not the same type of cryptozoological hoax or myth. He said if anybody ever mentioned this stuff to him before when he first moved into Mineral County, he would have probably thought they were crazy. But after seeing so many strange things himself there over the years, including these 2 creatures, he can't help but think otherwise. The White Pine Sheriff Department has their own share of Dogman, Skinwalker, and Wildman sightings as well. In fact, even one of their dispatchers actually sent her husband out to investigate a report that she herself had received one night, then called me about an hour later, saying that her husband saw the creature, just like the person who had called in the sighting reported. She was shaken up pretty bad by it, so I stayed on the phone with her until she calmed down. Told her to please not send anybody else out there anymore. This is just some of what's been going on in this area for years now. Most people around here think that whatever these creatures are, they've probably already lived out here and have always lived out here for some time, but maybe eventually migrated somewhere else. Whatever you believe, this is not your own decision, but it will be respected either way. Thank you for reading this report. Have a great day. Through the years, I have had several sightings of what I believe to be a dogman. One of my friends first saw it in 1994. She was returning home from shopping at a department store when she encountered this creature crossing her driveway on all fours as she pulled up to park the car. It stood up on 2 legs, looked at her, and made eye contact for a few moments before turning off and walking into the fields behind the property. What has made me certain that this is indeed the same dogman that I've had several sightings of is because about an hour after she told me the story, which, now that I think about it, was already 2 years ago, I had gone outside myself to check something outside, related to our business. When I opened the door, there were these 3 distinct howling sounds that came from our northwest. There were 2 howls and a long whistle. I answered in kind, and it replied in kind twice and 3 times. I've had several sightings of dogmen since then, including one when I was at home, alone, sleeping in my bed after working a secondary shift. This creature came up onto our porch from behind our small storage unit building that is also on our property line, stepping over the railing to get into the yard. All that could be seen from this encounter were its glowing eyes from about 20 feet away, and it walked past where I could see out of the window next to my bed. He or she or it did not appear to notice me or also want to be seen. He kept going around where he kept a few lawnmowers, but ultimately, I never saw him. If he had come into our yard for a reason, or if he had saw me looking out the window, I'm sure he would have stopped coming towards me. That encounter happened on early March, in the morning, about 4:15 to 4:30 a.m. I also know of another sighting, where one of my friends supposedly caught it on video as it was chasing some deer through a field behind their house. He says that he saw the deer jumping through the field to the woods, and as soon as it made it into the open, it started running away from this thing. It changed directions immediately, until they were both out of sight. It gives off this terribly foul odor, along with these strange sounds that are almost deafening at times. The reason that there is more than one dogman around where we live, I have just too many friends and family that tell me their stories about spotting one in the area, and not just here in Ohio, all up through Michigan and Wisconsin alike, even some in Illinois. I have family spread out all throughout the Midwest. Here are just a few stories shared by them. My cousin saw it when he was in high school at night, walking through our field to meet it with some friends. Another friend who lives in Columbiana also saw it in her backyard during the evening when she was outside having a cigarette just by herself. This creature took her dog that was on its leash, dragging it along behind him until the leash broke. The only reason that it did not attack her is because she said, "You can have my dog, but leave me alone." Then right then, this thing turned around and killed her dog. My other friend who saw it first about 2 years ago on a Saturday night as he was driving back from a high school football game for his son. He said that it looked like a tall man with very broad shoulders, covered in thick, black, shaggy hair all over its body, except for its hands and legs, which were only covered partially in long dark fur. What was most noticeable to him is how big this thing's head was, how he said it was disproportionately oversized. It looked like a larger wolf, and it had glowing red eyes, almost like something you'd see out of an 80s horror movie, is how he described it. The body, though, appeared more primate-like. He also said there was an accompanying awful stench just moments before and after this creature's walk across the road. It made him think of a skunk, combined with some of their pungent body odor and rotting deer carcass. That's not all. My former father-in-law had 2 encounters with it. The first one was on his farm where he lived in Salineville, Ohio, back in '98. The second time was right outside our house here in Columbiana, about 6 years ago. That is when he came over to tell us, who lives here now, about the encounter. We were new people living here at the time. When I told him that there have been several of us who have seen this creature since, he did not believe me until my wife told him one of her stories. I've heard similar encounters from other people in the area, but nobody knows exactly what this thing is or why it would be living around here. There's been talk of hunters that have supposedly captured it before and even kept it in a cage somewhere to use as a hunting dog, but I don't buy that at all. I have personally never seen any proof of that or have heard any proof of that. Just word of mouth. It's all just hearsay. However, I cannot give you my own name out of fear of ridicule from the people who don't believe or understand what we are saying about it. Anybody else who is saying something about dogmen will call us liars, say that these stories are made up to just get attention. If anybody out there does get close enough to see it and survive to tell about it, I hope they also see just how harmless this creature can be, as I've seen it for myself. All you can do is just sit back and watch as the fear takes over you when somebody sees one. You will never know what this thing may do next, or where it could come from, but at least all we know is that hopefully you believe our story. Anyway, I'm sure you've heard people talk about this creature before, but I know that my stories is probably not what you expected to hear. I can understand how most people would laugh at us for saying what we did. Anyway, until they see it with their own eyes, then they'll truly be a believer. 5 years ago now, my friend and I were bored and decided to go outside and just chill beside his parents' garage. We were sitting there talking when we both heard a very loud howl from the woods near his backyard. It was an extremely loud, very high-pitched howl that lasted for roughly 15 seconds. This was not a coyote or a standard dog. This was something much larger, very unique and incredibly frightening, in my opinion. After hearing the sound, both of us just looked at each other with complete disbelief and confusion on our faces. We knew something had made it. It sounded so close, but we could not see anything in the darkness of the night, besides the vague shadows that came from the light that surrounded his back porch area. Even though this happened 5 years ago, I can still remember exactly what it sounded like, as if it had happened only days ago. This is definitely one of those unexplained events that is forever burned into my memory. There is nothing like the fear you get when you look up at the night sky and see a giant UFO, which does happen a lot here in Illinois. But then there is the adrenaline rush that comes over you when you're outside with your friends and all of a sudden you hear this very loud howling from deep in the woods. It really brings in the whole werewolf overtones. It's an unsettling feeling. It makes you feel like you're not safe if you can go back inside. I'm pretty sure no regular forest animal could produce such a noise. The only thing I could think of as an explanation for this would be a dogman or a Bigfoot. Just maybe he was looking for love and came out of the forest to find a bit of romance, maybe? If you have any thoughts as to what could have made this sound, I would love to know, because I'm really looking for answers. In fact, my cousin actually lived in a very rural setting, just outside of a town called Greenville, near McLeansboro, Illinois, for several years now, and he's told me about several unusual encounters with something he claims was not human or a regular dog. He will only tell these stories to close friends and family who will respect him enough not to make fun or start laughing at his expense. He told me that in 2005, he had purchased an old house within the woods, apparently was haunted by something unknown. It didn't bother him until after the remodel, when they returned from vacation in 2006. He found the house completely in shambles. The previous owner had left all of his belongings behind, but rather something very different taking place. There were large holes in the walls that looked like they were made by somebody swinging a sledgehammer at a drywall without even scratching the paint. Broken glass. Everything had been pulled out, and the closets thrown about with such force it didn't slide around. Things were actually punctured through other objects or smashed. They also found giant canine footprints and blood and dirt all throughout the house. There was also a couple of carcasses of animals in there as well, torn up, not even eaten on. It's just like something walked in the house, ripped up some dead animals and threw it around. When he tells me this, I always imagine a big angry dog coming in with a dead squirrel in its mouth and shaking it violently, the same way a dog would shake as it shakes its body to dry water off. And all around the house or cabin, there were these large canine prints. My cousin believes that whoever or whatever did this had to have unbelievable strength for it to tear everything up in the way it did and bust down the door. Even the solid wood furnitures like coffee tables and such were just destroyed. Many objects like dishes, vases, picture frames, they all had things broken through them, and strange blood everywhere. This, of course, is just one example of his weird stories. I could tell you more, and his family believe what they experienced was something other than a person, and very different from other paranormal activity that can easily be explained. My cousin also believes he has seen 2 Bigfoots on occasion while hunting in the Shawnee National Forest. He's also found other tracks in the woods which lead him to believe there might be more than one out there, a Dogman and a Bigfoot. As fast as these creatures are said to be, I'm sure they can travel undetected by casual human presence for short periods of time. Although, he's never actually seen one standing up close, so he believes they may be completely bipedal and very tall. He has since built a new small cabin on the other side of town and still claims to wake up in the middle of the night some days due to weird noises or presences. But he won't say what exactly that disturbs his sleep, making him feel uneasy and kind of scared. I was just looking through your YouTube for some fun and wondering if you had heard of anything similar to what I'm telling you. I have not heard many of your videos, so I'm assuming this is the case, but I just wanted to make sure. I just want to remind you that my cousin is very leery of sharing his experiences with others who might laugh at him or think he's crazy, so I would appreciate it if you can keep my name and his name out of this email. Thanks for listening. My family owns over 300 acres of woodland that our entire family uses to hunt on every fall. I've seen something I just can't explain, and I've hunted those woods since I was just a boy. I know every inch of that land. But this is something even I can explain, and it's disturbed me greatly. Maybe you can help me find answers. By the way, this was just southeast of Pontiac in Illinois. There's a main highway running north to south that cuts right through these woods. The house that I live on is located at the northern portion of our land. My stand is about 3/4 of a mile south of my house on the west side. You can clearly see it from this highway. At around 6:30 a.m. on October 16th, 2012, opening day of gun season here in Illinois, I had just climbed into my tree stand when I saw lights traveling down this road. The person driving this truck has no affiliation with this story other than that he appeared to be driving at the exact same moment and place. He got out of his truck, and after seeing me up in my stand, asked if I'd seen anything yet. I told him no, and he said cool and left me after a few minutes, a little bit of small talk about the weather, etc. The reason I mention this man is because if nothing was happening there, or was nothing to see yet, why would somebody get out of their car in the woods just to wave and leave? As we all know, curiosity kills the cat, so maybe that's what he was doing here. So, back to me sitting inside my stand about 6:30 a.m. It's only me and 2 other hunters that hunt this land. They don't even use the stand, so they wouldn't be coming from either direction anytime soon. For some reason, the hair stood up on the back of my neck like something wasn't right. I turned my head to the left, and looked out over this field that was south of my stand. I knew there wouldn't be anything in there, but you could see for about a good 400 yards. Nothing to obstruct your vision, except woods at the bottom of a large hill. So there I am looking when, all of a sudden, something caught my attention, way off in the distance. It was kind of like watching an old silent film, just staring at it, waiting for it to move again so I could get a better view. It's not moving, just sitting there eerily still. And then all of a sudden, it began moving towards me. At first, I thought it might have been one of those deer that are during heat in this time of year, or so. But when the deer came closer, I realized something definitely was wrong with it. The head was kind of cocked to one side, with its ear down. It made me think it was sick. But then it opened its mouth, and this low, guttural howl or growl came out of it. It sounded like a mix between a lion and a cow, or a wolf. Keep in mind this was at a distance, and as it got closer, it began to take more and more shape, and I realized this was no deer at all, but actually a very, very large canine. The size of this thing was huge. It was like an Irish wolfhound, if not bigger. I was practically frozen in my stand. I couldn't move at all for some reason. I was just simply too terrified to do anything. That's when I saw its mouth open again, and this horrible scream came out that sent chills up my spine. Then, just as quick as running, whatever this thing was jets into the air about 20 feet and starts bounding off these cedar trees here. I can remember when I finally got over the shock of all this, jumping out of my stand and running like hell, never looking back. This large dog was now bounding after me faster than I could even run. So eventually, it had caught up with me and tried to grab my arm in its mouth. It easily tore through my sleeve into my flesh, and I still have this scar on my arm that day. That's when I stopped running, closed my eyes expecting death at any moment, but nothing happened. After a few seconds, I opened them again and this creature was standing there, now about 20 feet away from me. That's when it started to howl at me and growl and make all these sort of weird freaky noises. My memory at this point is kind of a blur. I think it let go of my arm and just started pacing back and forth like it wasn't sure what to do. After pacing back and forth and snarling here and there, it eventually turned and left off into the woods. And poof, before I knew it, it was gone. I felt so relieved that whatever this thing was had left without truly harming me, even though I was bleeding pretty bad. I had a chunk of flesh missing out of my arm. I'll tell you my secret weapon. I had doused myself in deer urine that day. Not literally urine, but the smell and pheromones I had put all over my body. And I almost wonder if that smell alone is why this large dog creature did not continue to bite deeper into my arm, and why it was maybe pacing back and forth because maybe the smell was bothering it, and it wasn't sure what to do. If there's anything I learned through all of this, is that the woods aren't always the safest place in the world. This was in July of 2006. I was working full-time as a camp host, and my daughter and I had stayed in a cabin near Sioux Narrows, Ontario. This is 4 hours north of Kenora, near the Manitoba border, and it sits right on Lake of the Woods. The town itself consists mostly of summer people. There are some permanent residents, but most own cabins up there during the summer. There aren't any other native towns close by, the nearest being 30 kilometers away. So anyway, this is about 10 or 11 p.m. I can't remember exactly, but outside, my daughter saw something moving down at the end of the main street, where the grocery store and gas station sit. She thought it was a dog, but thought it was weird how big it was and the fact that it was walking upright. There's also an old railway bed that runs down the middle of the main street, so that way you can walk along there or sit on this bench and look out over the lake. The area is well lit by streetlights, but when I looked out at what my daughter was pointing at, I could not see anything until he stepped into one of the circles of light cast by one of the streetlights. At that point, it became clear that whatever I was looking at was not fully canine. It had to have been at least 9 to 10 feet tall. I mean, we're talking massive. I grabbed my binoculars, not knowing what exactly I'd be looking at. And when I looked up with them, whatever it was there that I thought had been standing. Even better, my daughter's friend who lives in a house right on the lake She was one of the people working with us that summer. She saw it too, running back to her house. I have no idea what we saw, but neither my daughter or her friend have any tendencies towards being easily frightened. They're both very aware of their surroundings, as well as practical and down to earth. This is why there's nothing paranormal about our sightings. Whatever we saw happened in broad daylight, not the middle of the night during a full moon or anything like that. I think what we saw was a Bigfoot. I don't know what it was doing, but I didn't see any evidence that it had been eating our garbage or anything like that. But come to think of it, maybe it wasn't a Bigfoot. It did look rather canine-ish, having a large dog-like head, but a very barrel-like body. Kind of more like a primate. I have no idea why anybody would think this is anything else. I also don't know what this could be as far as the realm of paranormal or supernatural goes. I have no religious overtones to our sighting at all. But what we saw wasn't wholly in the least bit. Also, I feel the height estimate is pretty accurate. Judging by where it was under the light post, that's about how tall it was. As far as color, he looked pretty black, except the light shining on his face, body, arms, and feet. There were patches of more of a smoky gray. I'd love to know what you think about all this. I was hiking with some friends in the spring of an older logging road. This was right by Highway 11, not far from North Bay. We went to a plateau and saw some older tracks. They were very large and looked to be bipedal canine tracks. Interesting. There were even large claw indents in the dirt. You could tell that whatever made these tracks had to have been of considerable size and weight. That was just based off seeing these handful of prints, so who knows. It's odd because I remember following them and not being able to see where they started from. But we thought nothing of it, right? At least, we tried to brush it off as most we could. We could still see the direction it went though, so we followed those trails instead. Mostly because there were 3 prints going together, as if they were walking with each other along the path. A couple smaller ones, and it looked like maybe like one big one. After a while, it felt like we were being followed by something. We started to smell this overwhelming odor, like pungent wet dog and urine, that was so strong. It was nearly vomit-inducing. We couldn't find a source of the smell, which was odd. It just seemed to be washing over us as if it were carried on the wind around us. The smell just continued to get stronger and stronger the further we went up the trail, but there was no large animal life signs at all. No droppings, no fur, no tracks, nothing. This was after the tracks before had stopped. I thought I'd heard something behind me like movement in the brush, or maybe footsteps even, trampling through dead leaves or sticks, crackling underfoot. This might have been just my friend's heavy breathing. So I turned around to look and saw nothing but forest for miles and miles. This is since you can't see down into a valley below us, with very little foliage. Anyway, needless to say, once we made it back out of the trail, we hightailed it back to the car and got out of there. We didn't go back to that trail ever again after that incident. I did stop by a ranger station when I saw it on our way down. They said nothing, but had been reported about an animal sighting attack. No, this is not a werewolf, but it could be something else. Something that I don't believe was a Bigfoot. It was something. I know what I heard and smelt and saw wasn't normal. I don't know how to describe it really. It's hard to say if it was some kind of predator, though the tracks did seem to indicate 2-leg locomotion. The closest thing I could equate to this is maybe one of those Yowie sightings near Australia. You know, where they have a similar description of a large, hairy, smelly man that stands upright and walks with 2 legs. I was aware of the Yowie legend since it's very popular in my country, and we do have many wild places to explore, so it wasn't surprising when I heard about the sighting. I don't know if any have been reported on this before, but I'm glad to see some people talking about it. And if you didn't know, a dogman is a bipedal canine cryptid, most often associated with the northern regions of Michigan and Wisconsin, there in North America. It is named after the French-Flemish mythological hybrid monster, best known from medieval art as a crescent-horned, cloven-hoofed man-eating monster that could transform itself into a wolf to devour man and livestock alike. The werewolf legend is known as the loup-garou in French, meaning werewolf. It was believed by medieval Europeans that lycanthropy was an infectious disease passed on by the bite of another lycanthrope, which resulted in an intense craving for human flesh. This legend may have originated due to actual wolf attacks combined with rabies infections. Howling at night has also been mistaken for this cryptid's vocalizations, tying it back to the Dogman legend even more closely. Even with all those things aside, I cannot refute the smell that day, and most importantly, the tracks. That was something way out of this world. First off, I was visiting family in Nova Scotia and had to go out for a walk. It was late afternoon. I decided to take my dog with me. I left the house along the highway toward the museum. Not sure how far I would make it because I didn't have any food or water. Stupid, I know. I noticed there were quite a few blackberry bushes on the way, so I took the time to eat as many as possible. They are in abundance right now in this area of Nova Scotia, but will be gone soon since it's nearly early autumn. As usual, my golden Labrador somehow managed to get in all of them before me. Just after that, at about 100 meters from the road, I heard something smacking around and shaking violently, one of those big pines close by. Then, shaking and moving on to another pine. Then there were trees shaking everywhere. I was shocked because all the trees were big pines, bigger than me with massive trunks, and they were being violently shook. What happened here? I felt my hair standing on end. Something bad was about to happen. I knew it. But what? It had really frightened an animal or birds in the area, looking at how many leaves are on the ground. There's a tree stump near where the huge tree had been cut down. Could this have startled whatever was out there? It sounded like one of those creatures that people report stepping over their back fence into the woods behind their house after some violent sounds disturb them. You know that sound that starts dogs barking furiously outside during the night, but you can't find what made the sound. Something had startled it pretty bad. I heard stomping noises after that. Movements that could have been feet on the ground. Something running through branches on top of yards and fallen pine needles. And then it continued even more, shaking more trees violently, just across the road. I couldn't believe it. I ran home as fast as possible. I know now better than to walk out there alone in the forest during the late afternoon, and even thought about writing this account so others would know. The older couple who was in this own house are very welcoming people. They have many acres of land around them, though maybe not all so friendly in this area. I did not ask them about it when I visited to get permission to use their yard for my sighting. Granddad said they were only shocked that such a creature was living in the woods. But he had shared stories with me of people reportedly seeing a large upright canine. I live in an area where mostly people are friendly, but even here there are stories passed around of strange creatures coming down from the hills at night. Things you hear about that go bump in the night near old cemeteries, caves and rocky outcroppings. Then there are persistent dogman stories all over North America. The dogman is supposed to be some sort of upright walking man-like creature, fur all over its body, very strong, sometimes reported covered with blood. Maybe it likes to eat raw meat. It's also said to live in the woods and travel underground through tunnels, like a mole. So what I was startled by was maybe a big black bear, maybe a dogman, or did I somehow disturb a Sasquatch? A horseman, perhaps? Maybe something else entirely. There are many stories of ghosts and other entities. There's even one about an angry lizard man living in this area. My grandfather told me all about it. We used to talk about it when we would walk out in the backyard forest at night. It wasn't scary for me back then because he made sure I never saw anything that may have been too frightening. What do you think it could have been, making all that racket? Could it be from an unknown creature? Or could this have just simply been teenagers out there playing tricks, trying to surprise somebody? I don't know, but I will think twice about taking that shortcut back home again. I'm going to try and be as detailed as I can with my sighting report. This was in 2009, in Skamania County, in Washington State, up near Trout Lake. This is where I had heard strange vocalizations that I'm pretty sure were not of Bigfoot. I feel the need to preface this report with some slight background information. First off, I work at a government contracting facility that is highly classified. We are stationed all over the country, but Our primary location rests in Virginia. Because of this, I'm unable to disclose the exact location of the incident due to security concerns. With this said, I will still do my best to give directions using reference points without giving anything away. The other thing worth noting is what we call the Dogman. Wikipedia has some good information on Dogman if you want to read up on it, but basically it's like a canine Bigfoot. So again, this happened in 2009, during deer season, when everybody was trying their luck for either mountain lion or mule deer after hiking around. There's not much activity in this area during the winter, so the local wildlife seems to enjoy it. Wolves, elk, deer, bear are all common sightings if you take a walk through the woods around here. I'm not sure what brought me out to this location, but I had heard these howls on consecutive nights after hiking up Trout Lake Road, past Appleton Pass. If you can't tell by now, it's near Trout Lake. On the first night, I heard them. They were quite loud and garbled like somebody was trying to imitate a wolf's vocalizations. It sounded like a wolf crossed with a man, but screaming. The closest thing I could compare it to is the howling, which you might have seen at some point. It was very loud and echoed through the entire timber of the forest. I could tell that it was quite off in the distance, but it sounded like it was on the right other side of the ridge. On the second night, I heard them again. They seemed closer and much more defined, almost as if I could discern words being spoken through the howling. The only real thing that I can compare this to is when you are driving down a road with a loud engine noise or loud music playing in your car, so you have to turn up the volume to understand what is being said. This time, however, it wasn't just one set of howls traveling through the valley. They were at least 3 total, back and forth, a response and a callback. This time, they seemed much closer, louder and very distinctive, with only minimal amounts of interference, due to not being able to receive the frequencies directly. There were at least 3 separate pack members communicating with each other that I could tell from the howling. Their calls also intertwined with one another, until it was just kind of garbled noise. One of my friends who lives in this area has claimed he has heard them before, but the first time I'd ever seen or heard anything like this, so it's definitely piqued my curiosity. I've been back here several times since on my own free time, hiking up to Appleton Pass during deer season when everybody was bugling for deer without hearing a single vocalization. I know this area, this entire state is a hotspot for Bigfoot, but I've heard Bigfoot before. This was not one. Not really sure what to make of these encounters, but after spending some time researching the history behind this phenomena, it's actually quite interesting. Like most things, you can't believe everything you hear, and rumors are always exaggerated. But regardless of your beliefs, it's definitely an interesting read. This is what I would classify as a Class A encounter based on the information I was able to scratch together. You should be able to get some decent insight into other sightings all over the country if you look up anything on Dogman. I realize this report might seem vague, but it's probably for the best, due to security concerns. If anybody has had any similar experiences, I'd love to hear them. It'd be nice to see if anybody has heard or experienced anything like this before. Just wanted to share my experience here with everybody, in hopes that you can post in the comments. Thank you for reading, and let me know what you think below. I was at Fool's Hollow Lake, near Sholo, Arizona, in 2012. I was in a boat with my friend when I saw what looked like a large black coyote standing upright on the north side of the lake. At first, I thought it was maybe somebody in a ghillie suit, but realized there are no people out there. It stared into the light that we had on the boat for roughly 30 seconds, then tried walking toward us. Its head and body seemed to be swaying back and forth as if it were drunk or something. At 65 yards away, I can make out all of its features, eyes, ears, mouth, etc., and the creature actually got within 100 feet of us before turning around and running back off. I believe that this was a large dogman, roughly 7 to 8 feet tall. Its head, neck, and shoulders were all very muscular. I could not make out the arms as it ran off on all fours, but it had a huge barrel-like chest, shoulder muscles that were rippling and wider than its waistline. It walked into the woods across the valley, and a minute later, we heard what sounded like somebody yelling in some strange language, as if trying to communicate with something. We didn't see any lights, so we didn't think we interrupted anybody's rituals or ceremonies. And within 5 minutes of us leaving, loud screams rang out from one of those whiny coyote screams to deep bear growls and everything in between. This came from all over the mountainside behind us and continuing for about 20 minutes. I think it was trying to communicate with and call for help from maybe its buddies. I don't know if it were Dogman or Bigfoot, but my heart is still racing just thinking about how close it came to us that night. When I walked back down the mountain the next day, something I feel was hunting me. I could sense it. It would howl at me and then wait for a response and do it again. At first, of course, I ignored it for about 30 minutes of this. I became freaked out and started running up the mountain as fast as possible, doing anything in my power to get away from whatever this thing was. To be honest, the last thing I wanted to see is one in the light. I'm an avid hunter and fisherman on Fool's Hollow Lake, so we'd come out there all the time. We used to come across weird tracks, but always just chalked it up to coyotes. Now that I think about it, they were generally in a biped pattern. Could this be a Dogman sighting or something else? I know what I saw and my friend confirmed everything I was seeing. Seems like Dogmen are here in Arizona too. What do you think? My grandfather has told me similar stories like this, but they really intertwine with the Skinwalker legends around here too. One story he shared with me back before this in 2009 was of an event that happened on the White Mountain Apache Reservation near Greer, Arizona. He said that his grandfather was running cattle about 50 feet apart when suddenly this 6 to 7 foot tall bipedal creature covered in really long hair jumped out of some trees at him. He said it had claws like a bear but no face, so he threw his thing over its head, started to choke it before it to swing him around by his rope. He managed to get close enough to stake one end of the rope into the ground with 7 spikes while still holding onto the other end. And suddenly, the beast simply vanished into thin air. The old man then walked up and asked what had happened. My grandfather informed him that he had an encounter with some kind of creature of the night, and the old man told him they were called Chindi. He said it was a skinwalker and should not tell anybody about this incident, or they would come back for him and his family. That was my only conversation with my grandfather about skinwalkers, until I learned more about them when I joined the UFO community, right around 2011 to 2012. He's never been known to BS, so when he tells me something, I listen. We both agree that we saw Dogman in Arizona. You be the judge.